My mother-in-law slapped me 3 times across the face at our family Christmas dinner, calling my 5-year-old daughter and me garbage that polluted her elite bloodline. My husband grabbed my hand and we walked out the front door without looking back. What she did not realize as she screamed insults at my back was that I was not just the quiet accountant she despised. I was the silent owner of the private equity firm that held the debt to her entire real estate empire. 3 hours later, her world came crashing down. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. My name is Rachel, and at 33 years old, I have spent nearly a decade perfecting the art of biting my tongue. Growing up in a working-class neighborhood in Chicago, my parents taught me the value of hard work and humility. When I met David during our sophomore year of college, I had no idea he came from the kind of generational wealth that dictated everything about a person's worth. David was studying to be a history professor, completely uninterested in his family business. His parents, William and Patricia, lived in a sprawling mansion in the wealthiest suburb of Boston. From the first day David introduced me, Patricia made her disdain painfully clear. To her, I was a gold digger who had manipulated her son into abandoning his rightful place in high society. I drove a used sedan, wore sensible clothes from department stores, and worked as an accountant at a mid-tier firm. In her eyes, my existence was an insult to their legacy. Over the years, the hostility only escalated, especially after David and I got married in a small, quiet ceremony that Patricia refused to attend. When our daughter Lily was born, we hoped the arrival of their first grandchild would soften their hearts. Instead, it only gave them a new target. They constantly criticized my parenting, my home, and my career. My sister-in-law, Ashley, the undisputed golden child of the family, eagerly joined her mother in the campaign to make me feel small. Ashley was 30 years old, never held a real job, and spent her days bouncing between country clubs and luxury boutiques. This particular Christmas Eve was supposed to be a turning point. David had pleaded with me to give them one more chance, hoping the holiday spirit might inspire a truce. I reluctantly agreed, wrapping Lily in her velvet holiday dress and baking a pecan pie from scratch. When we arrived at the massive iron gates, my stomach tightened into familiar knots. The house was blazing with elaborate light displays, and the driveway was lined with expensive cars belonging to extended family members and business partners, William always invited. We stepped into the grand foyer where a towering Christmas tree dominated the space. The air smelled of expensive catering and pine needles, but the emotional temperature was freezing. Patricia greeted David with a warm embrace, completely ignoring me as I stood holding Lily's hand. When she finally looked down at my daughter, she offered a tight fake smile and criticized Lily's dress for being off the rack. I swallowed the lump in my throat, reminding myself I was doing this for David. We made our way into the opulent dining room, where crystal glasses sparkled under custom chandeliers and silver platters were arranged with precision. Dinner was a masterclass in passive aggression. I was seated at the far end of the long mahogany table. Ashley sat directly across from me, flanked by her wealthy friends who had been invited to fill out the table. Ashley made sure to project her voice so the entire room could hear her thinly veiled insults. She talked at length about her recent shopping trip to Paris, asking me if I had ever left the country. When I replied that I had been busy with tax season, she laughed, a sharp, mocking sound that echoed in the room. The real trouble started when it was time to exchange gifts. I had spent weeks knitting a custom cashmere scarf for Ashley, trying to find something personal and thoughtful that could not simply be bought at a designer store. When I handed her the beautifully wrapped box, she tore the paper off with careless haste. She pulled out the soft gray scarf, held it up with 2 fingers, as if it were contaminated, and let out a dramatic sigh. "Oh, Rachel," she said, her voice dripping with pity. "This is very sweet, but you know I have a severe allergy to cheap materials. I only wear imported silk." Before I could even process the insult, she tossed the scarf directly into the trash bin near the serving cart. A heavy silence fell over the room. Several guests exchanged uncomfortable glances, but no one said a word. David opened his mouth to defend me, his face red with anger, but I placed a gentle hand on his knee, signaling him to wait. I had spent 8 years taking their abuse, but tossing my handmade gift into the garbage was a line I refused to let them cross. I looked Ashley straight in the eyes, my expression entirely calm. "I understand, Ashley," I said, my voice steady and clear, carrying across the quiet room. "It is just like that stunning diamond necklace you are wearing right now. It takes a very specific taste to confidently wear a mass-produced cubic zirconia piece from a discount mall kiosk to a formal Christmas dinner." The table gasped collectively. Ashley's hand immediately flew to her throat, her face draining of color. She had been bragging about the necklace all evening, claiming it was a rare vintage piece acquired at an exclusive auction. The sheer accuracy of my observation left her sputtering, unable to form a coherent sentence. Patricia stood up abruptly, her chair scraping loudly against the hardwood floor. Her face was contorted with a rage so visceral it made the guests recoil. She marched down the length of the table, her heels clicking aggressively. Before I could even stand up to face her, she raised her hand and struck me across the face. The sharp crack of the slap echoed through the dining room. I barely had time to turn my head before she struck me a second time and then a third. The pain blossomed across my cheek, but the shock was far more profound. "You are nothing but trash!" Patricia screamed, her voice breaking with hysteria. "You are a low-level nobody who polluted our family. My son deserves better than a pathetic accountant." She then pointed a shaking manicured finger directly at my terrified 5-year-old daughter, who was now crying softly. "Take that trash and get out." I did not beg. I did not cry. I simply stood up and maintained icy, unblinking eye contact with the woman who had just assaulted me. I let the silence hang in the air, forcing everyone in the room to sit with the horrific reality of what had just occurred. David did not hesitate for a fraction of a second. He shoved his chair back so hard it crashed to the floor, shattering a crystal wine glass. He stepped between his mother and me, his fists clenched at his sides. "You are dead to me," he told his mother, his voice a low, dangerous rumble that I had never heard before. "Do not ever try to contact us again." He scooped a crying Lily into his arms, grabbed my hand firmly in his, and turned his back on the empire he had been born into. We walked down the long hallway, through the grand foyer, and out the front doors, leaving the mansion behind us. We did not ever look back. The freezing air hit my stinging cheek the moment we stepped out of the heavy oak doors. The gravel crunched beneath our shoes as we walked toward our old sedan, parked at the edge of the sprawling driveway. David held Lily tight, shielding her from the wind and trauma of what had unfolded. I walked beside him, moving with cold precision. The pain from Patricia's slaps was fading, replaced by a steady hum of adrenaline. When we reached the car, David fumbled, dropping his keys onto the frosted pavement. I picked them up, unlocked the doors, and helped him buckle Lily into her car seat. I stroked her hair and whispered that everything was going to be fine, that we were safe and going home. Once in the front seats, the heavy silence wrapped around us. David gripped the steering wheel, staring straight ahead at his parents' mansion. He put the car in gear and drove us through the iron gates, leaving his entire past in the rearview mirror. The drive back to our house was suffocatingly quiet. The heater blasted warm air, but David looked as though he was freezing. After 10 minutes of navigating the snow-lined roads, he spoke, his voice cracking under the weight of the evening. "Rachel, I am so sorry," he whispered. "I should have protected you and Lily." I rested my hand on his arm. "You defended us, David. You walked away from your family. That is all that matters to me." He shook his head. "You do not understand what this means. My mother is not going to let this go. She is going to destroy us." He took a shaky breath. David was a brilliant professor, but his salary barely covered our mortgage and basic living expenses. For the past 6 years, his parents had heavily supplemented our income through a family trust fund established in his name. It was the only reason we could afford Lily's school tuition and keep our heads above water. Patricia controlled that trust and used it like a weapon to keep David compliant. "Without that money," David stammered, panic rising in his chest. "Without that trust fund, we are going to lose everything. The mortgage, the car payments, Lily's school. We do not have the savings to survive a cutoff from my parents. My mother knows exactly how vulnerable we are. She is going to freeze my accounts by morning." I listened to his fears, keeping my expression neutral. I rubbed his arm, telling him we would figure it out together, and no money was worth enduring that abuse. What I did not tell him was that I had spent the last 5 years ensuring we would never need a single dime of his family's toxic wealth. We arrived home just shortly after 10:30. The small house felt like a sanctuary after the suffocating grandeur of the Crestwood estate. David carried a sleeping Lily to her room, tucking her into bed and leaving the door ajar. I walked into the kitchen and put the kettle on the stove, needing the familiar routine to ground the evening. David paced our living room, running his hands through his hair. He was waiting for the fallout. He kept glancing at his phone, anticipating angry messages from his sister or demanding voicemails from his mother. But his phone remained completely silent. The quiet seemed to unnerve him even more than a screaming match would have. "It is too quiet," he muttered as I poured 2 mugs of tea. "My mother never backs down from a fight. She should be flooding my phone with threats, telling me I am cut out of the will. Why is she not calling?" "Because she is busy, David," I said softly. "Take a breath. Drink your tea. We are safe in our home, and whatever she does tomorrow, we will handle it." I sat at the dining table, tracking the exact timeline of events. I knew precisely why Patricia was not calling. She was dealing with a crisis far larger than her bruised ego. I had set a specific sequence of events into motion months ago, waiting for the perfect moment to execute the final command. When Ashley threw my gift in the trash and Patricia struck me across the face, they had unknowingly given me the exact signal I needed. While David was buckling Lily into her car seat, I had sent a single encrypted text message to my chief operating officer. The message contained only one word: execute. The clock on the microwave marked the passage of time. 11:30 slowly turned into midnight. David finally sat down at the table, his exhaustion overcoming his anxiety. He buried his face in his hands, rubbing his tired eyes. We sat together in the quiet house. Then, exactly 3 hours after we had walked out of the mansion, David's cell phone shattered the silence. The loud ringing caused us both to jump. David stared at the screen, his face draining of whatever color it had left. "It is my father," he whispered, his voice filled with dread. "He is probably calling to officially disown me." "Answer it," I said, taking a sip of my tea. "Let us hear what William has to say." David hesitated before accepting the call and placing the phone on speaker in the center of the table. "Dad," he started to say, his voice defensive. "Look, if you are calling to defend what Mom did." William cut him off immediately. His voice did not carry the usual arrogant tone of a real estate mogul. Instead, he sounded breathless, frantic, and completely unhinged. "David, listen to me. I do not care about the argument with your mother right now. Something terrible has just happened. Your mother just found out and the whole house is in an absolute panic." "What are you talking about?" David asked, his brow furrowing in confusion. "What did she find out?" "The bank just froze Crestwood Estate's primary credit line," William practically shouted into the receiver. "All of it, David, every single account. I just got an emergency alert from our chief financial officer. The mezzanine debt was called in. The entire portfolio is locked. We cannot make payroll tomorrow morning. The subcontractors for the new luxury development are going to walk off the site by noon if those funds do not clear." David stared at the phone, bewildered by this sudden catastrophe. "Dad, I do not understand. How does a bank just freeze a credit line of that magnitude without warning?" "I do not know," William yelled, the sound of Patricia sobbing echoing in the background. "The bank representative said the debt was sold to an aggressive private equity firm, and they initiated an immediate freeze due to a breach of covenant clause. We are completely locked out of our own operating capital. David, I need you to come back to the house right now. I need you to co-sign a bridge loan using your trust fund as collateral so we can cover payroll tomorrow until I sort this out." David looked at the phone, his expression hardening as he processed the request. His mother had assaulted his wife and humiliated his daughter 3 hours ago, and now his father was demanding he risk his financial security to save their empire. Without a word of apology, William expected David to act like the obedient son, playing his assigned role. David reached out and pressed the red button, disconnecting the call. He hung up in disgust, pushing the phone away. "I am not doing it," he said, his voice steady and resolute. Let them sink. He stood up, kissed the top of my head, and walked down the hallway to check on Lily before heading to the bedroom. I remained seated at the dining table alone in the dim light. I picked up my phone and opened the secure application used to monitor my holdings. The dashboard illuminated my face, displaying the real-time status of the corporate takeover. I simply smiled in the dark. I did not tell David yet, but I was the ghost buyer. My covertly owned private equity firm Vanguard Solutions had just initiated the freeze. The morning sun crept through the blinds, casting long shadows across our bedroom floor. I woke up to the sound of David pacing in the hallway. When I walked into the kitchen, he was staring at his laptop screen with a look of pure devastation. His coffee sat untouched on the counter. I leaned against the doorframe, waiting for him to speak. He ran a shaking hand over his face and turned the laptop toward me. My mother did it, he said, his voice hollow. I looked at the screen displaying his personal banking portal. Every single account connected to the Crestwood Family Trust showed a balance of 0 or was marked as locked. The joint credit cards he had used since graduate school were flagged as inactive. Patricia was executing her standard playbook of control. She believed that by completely freezing his trust fund and canceling his credit cards, she could starve him out. Her logic was simple and ruthless. Without the financial cushion he had relied on his entire adult life, the pressure of a mortgage, car payments, and raising a child would become unbearable. She assumed the stress would eventually break our marriage, forcing David to crawl back to the estate and beg for forgiveness without me. David closed the laptop. We have $50 in our checking account, Rachel. How are we supposed to buy groceries for Lily? How are we going to pay the heating bill? I walked over and wrapped my arms around his shoulders, pressing a kiss to his temple. We are going to be fine, I assured him, keeping my tone entirely level. Let us just focus on today. We need milk and fresh fruit for Lily anyway. Get dressed and we will go to the grocery store together. He looked at me as if I had lost my mind. Did you not hear me, Rachel? We have $50 to our name. My mother cut off everything. I grabbed my purse. Then we will spend $49. Come on. The drive to the supermarket was tense. David gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. He kept checking his phone, hoping for a sign that the bank error was just a temporary glitch. But William was currently fighting his own massive financial fire, completely unaware that his wife was busy punishing their son. We walked through the sliding glass doors of the grocery store into the bright fluorescent lighting. I grabbed a shopping cart and headed straight for the produce section, picking out organic strawberries and crisp apples. David trailed behind me, calculating the cost of every single item I placed in the basket. Rachel, maybe we should skip the organic fruit this week, he whispered nervously. We need to be careful. We are being careful, I replied, dropping a block of aged cheddar into the cart. As we approached the checkout lanes, I could see the panic rising in David's chest. He pulled out his wallet, staring at the collection of useless plastic cards. We unloaded our groceries onto the conveyor belt. The cashier, a cheerful young woman, scanned each item with practiced speed. The total climbed higher and higher, easily surpassing the $50 sitting in David's isolated checking account. That will be $112.40, the cashier announced, bagging the final items. David swallowed hard. He pulled out his primary credit card, the one tied to the Crestwood Trust, and handed it to her. His hand was trembling slightly. The cashier swiped the card. A sharp beep echoed from the terminal. I am sorry, sir, it says declined, she said politely, holding the card back out to him. David's face flushed crimson. Can you try it again, please? She nodded and inserted the chip. The terminal beeped again, displaying the same rejection message. I am really sorry, but it is definitely declining. Do you have another form of payment? David looked at me, his eyes filled with a mixture of shame and terror. He reached for his wallet again, but his hands were shaking so badly he dropped a receipt onto the floor. The people in line behind us shifted impatiently. Patricia's plan was working perfectly in his mind. She was reducing her educated, capable son to a panicked mess in the middle of a grocery store. Before he could pull out his debit card and face the humiliation of insufficient funds, I stepped forward. I reached into my purse and bypassed the standard debit card I usually carried. Instead, I pulled out a heavy matte black corporate card and handed it to the cashier. She took it, her eyes widening slightly at the weight of the metal before tapping it against the reader. The transaction was approved instantly. We walked out to the parking lot in silence. David loaded the bags into the trunk, still processing what had just happened. When we got into the car, he did not start the engine. He just sat there staring at the steering wheel. "Rachel, what was that?" he asked, his voice quiet. "What was what?" "That card. You paid with a heavy metal credit card that did not even require a PIN. I know what those cards are. My father has one for his executive accounts. You need a massive verified income just to hold one. How does an accountant at a mid-tier firm have that tier of credit?" The moment had arrived to pull back the curtain. It was time to show him that his mother's attempt to enforce poverty was nothing but a pathetic illusion. "I am an accountant, David," I said. "But I am not just a number cruncher in a cubicle. When I told you I managed portfolios for a few private clients, I downplayed the scale. I operate a highly successful independent financial consultancy. I am the sole owner of a limited liability company managing assets for high net worth individuals." David stared at me, stunned. "What are you saying?" "I am saying that the modest salary you see deposited into our joint account every month is just my baseline draw," I explained to him very clearly. "The rest of my income stays within my corporate structure. I have spent the last 5 years building a very quiet, very lucrative business. We are not broke, David. We are not even close to being broke. We have more than enough to survive your mother's blockade indefinitely." He leaned back against his headrest, trying to comprehend the magnitude of my words. "You have been hiding this from me. I have been protecting us. I saw how Patricia threatened to cut off your cousins when they chose careers she disapproved of. I knew that one day she would try to use that same weapon against us. I needed to ensure that when that day came, her weapon would be useless." I reached across the center console and took his hand. "We do not need Crestwood Estates. We do not need the trust fund. You can continue teaching your history classes, and we can pay Lily's tuition without asking your family for a single cent. Patricia's attempt to starve us out has utterly failed because she has absolutely no idea who she is dealing with." David looked down at our joined hands and then back up at me. A slow realization washed over his face, replacing the lingering panic with a profound sense of relief. For his entire life, he had been chained to his family's wealth, terrified of the consequences if he ever stepped out of line. Now those chains were broken. He squeezed my hand tightly, a small smile finally breaking through his exhaustion. He started the car and pulled out of the parking lot, leaving his mother's financial trap far behind us. Patricia thought she was dealing with a helpless, dependent daughter-in-law. She had no idea she was stepping into a battlefield where she was hopelessly outgunned. David left for the university that morning with a renewed sense of purpose. He kissed me at the door, and for the first time in years, he did not look over his shoulder as if expecting his mother to materialize from the shadows. I watched his car pull out of the driveway before getting ready for my own day. I drove my sensible sedan to the downtown office of Mitchell & Sons, an unremarkable mid-tier accounting firm that perfectly suited my needs. For the past 4 years, this job had been my carefully constructed camouflage. It provided excellent health insurance, a predictable schedule, and most importantly, an unglamorous answer to the inevitable questions from the elite social circle David belonged to. Whenever Patricia or her wealthy friends asked what I did for a living, I would mention corporate tax compliance. It was the perfect shield, allowing me to operate Vanguard Solutions in complete anonymity. I sat at my cubicle sipping mediocre break room coffee and reviewing a standard tax filing for a local hardware store. My dual life was demanding, but entirely necessary. Vanguard Solutions was registered under a series of blind trusts and proxy directors, ensuring my name never appeared on any public filings. I usually handled my private equity work during my lunch hour or late at night while David was asleep. But today, my dual life was about to collide with the desperate need for control Patricia harbored. Around 10 in the morning, my desk phone rang. It was the receptionist asking me to come to the managing partner's corner office immediately. I walked down the carpeted hallway, sensing a shift in the office atmosphere. My direct supervisor avoided eye contact as I passed his open door. When I stepped into the spacious office, I found Thomas Mitchell, the senior partner, sitting behind his massive mahogany desk. Next to him sat the human resources director, a woman named Joan, who looked incredibly uncomfortable. "Please have a seat," Rachel Thomas said, gesturing to the leather chair opposite him. He did not offer his usual warm morning greeting. I sat resting my hands calmly in my lap. "Rachel, you have been a dependable employee here for 4 years." Joan started, her voice strained. "Your performance reviews have always been satisfactory, but unfortunately we have to let you go effective immediately." I did not gasp. I did not ask why. I simply tilted my head and waited for the real explanation. Thomas cleared his throat, adjusting his tie. "The truth is, Rachel, we received a call this morning from a very influential individual in the Boston business community. Someone who brings a significant amount of corporate client referrals to this firm through the regional country club. This individual made it abundantly clear that our continued relationship with their network depends entirely on terminating your employment today. We simply cannot afford to lose those accounts over one employee." He pushed a manila folder across the smooth wooden surface. Joan leaned forward, offering a sympathetic but pathetic look. "We have prepared a generous severance package," she explained softly. "It includes 3 months of pay and extended health coverage. We know this is incredibly sudden, and we want to make the transition as painless as possible given the circumstances." They both braced themselves, clearly expecting tears, a dramatic outburst, or a desperate plea to keep my job. Instead, I leaned back in the chair and let out a genuine, joyful laugh. The sound bounced off the walls of the quiet office. Thomas and Joan exchanged confused glances, completely thrown off by my reaction. "Are you quite all right, Rachel?" Thomas asked, his brow furrowing with concern. "I am wonderful, Thomas," I replied, a bright smile spreading across my face. "Actually, this is the best news I have received all week. You have no idea how much of a relief this is." I reached into my purse, pulled out my employee access badge, and tossed it casually onto the folder. "I do not need the severance package," I told them, standing up from the chair. "You can keep it or distribute it to the junior accountants as a bonus. It has been a pleasure working with you both, but I really must be going. I have far more important matters to attend to today." I turned and walked out of the office, leaving them sitting in stunned silence. The walk back to my cubicle felt like a victory lap. For years I had played the role of the quiet, unassuming accountant perfectly. Patricia thought she was destroying my livelihood. She thought she was ripping away my only source of independence and forcing me onto the street. She had no idea she was actually cutting the last string that tied me to a life of pretending. I grabbed my coffee mug and my winter coat, leaving everything else behind. I walked out of the corporate building and stepped into the crisp morning air, feeling a profound sense of liberation. I pulled my phone from my pocket and hailed an executive car service. As I waited by the curb, my screen lit up with an incoming call from David. I answered immediately. "Rachel, are you okay?" he asked, his voice tight with panic. "My mother just sent me a text message. She said your firm fired you. She said you are unemployed and that I need to come home before you ruin me completely." "Did she actually get you fired?" "She certainly tried," I said, keeping my tone light and breezy. "Do not worry about me, David. I am fine." "But your job," he stammered, clearly stressed by the escalating attacks. "Your health benefits, your daily routine. How can you be so calm about losing your job?" "Because, David, that job was just a hobby," I explained, stepping into the back of the sleek black car that had just pulled up to the curb. "It was a cover story to keep your family from asking too many questions about my consulting business. I only kept it so we could have normal health insurance and so I could fly under the radar. Being fired today is a blessing. It frees up my schedule completely." I was silent on the other end of the line, trying to process the continuous revelations about the woman he had been married to for years. "So you are not upset?" he finally asked. "I am thrilled," I assured him, watching the downtown buildings roll past the tinted windows of the car. "Tell your mother thank you for me if she texts you again. I have a lot of work to do today, and now I do not have to pretend to care about tax compliance." I hung up the phone and opened my secure email application. Patricia had played her openings, believing she was a chess grandmaster, moving pawns across the board. She had frozen the trust fund, canceled the credit cards, and orchestrated my termination all in the span of 12 hours. She thought she had stripped us of every resource and left us utterly defenseless. She expected a tearful phone call begging for mercy. She was waiting for the satisfaction of hearing me admit defeat. Instead, I was heading to a private office suite I maintained downtown. The false identity of the humble accountant was officially dead, and I was entirely free to unsheath my claws. I opened a message from my chief operating officer at Vanguard Solutions, detailing the panic currently unfolding at Crestwood Estates. They were bleeding cash and their reputation was taking a massive hit. I typed a quick response to my team, instructing them to hold the line and reject any appeals for a grace period. Patricia wanted to play games with our livelihood, so she was going to learn exactly what financial ruin truly felt like. Now she was about to face an adversary who possessed far more capital and absolutely zero mercy. The war had officially begun. The plush leather seat of my office at Vanguard Solutions felt incredibly comfortable as I settled in that morning. For the first time in 4 years, I did not have to worry about logging into a clunky accounting portal. William was desperately calling every bank in the city, unaware my firm had flagged his accounts. My cell phone buzzed, cutting through the quiet hum of the office. The Oak Ridge Academy was an elite private institution catering to the wealthiest families in the state. I picked up the phone expecting a routine update. Instead, the panicked voice of Mrs. Higgins, the headmistress, greeted me. Rachel, I am so sorry to interrupt your morning, but we have a severe situation unfolding in the main lobby. Your mother-in-law, Patricia, is here. She is demanding that we release Lily to her custody immediately. My grip on the phone tightened, but my voice remained perfectly calm. Is Lily safe? Yes, Mrs. Higgins assured me quickly. Lily is secure in her classroom, completely unaware of what is happening. We locked the doors to the administrative wing, but Patricia is threatening to call the police. She is acting very erratically. Do not call the police and do not let her near my daughter, I instructed. I will be there in 10 minutes. I hung up the phone and summoned Jackson and Grant, the 2 elite private security contractors I retained for corporate emergencies. Within 2 minutes, we were stepping into a heavily tinted black SUV. Patricia was operating under the delusion that I was a destitute, unemployed liability. She thought removing Lily would force David to crawl back to her begging. The SUV pulled up to the front entrance of the academy. Jackson and Grant stepped out first before opening my door. We walked into the grand marble lobby of the school. Today it was filled with the shrill echoes of Patricia's voice. She was standing at the front desk, waving her hands aggressively at a terrified receptionist. I am telling you to bring my granddaughter out here right now, Patricia demanded, slamming her palm against the wood counter. Her mother is a complete failure. She was fired from her pathetic little accounting job this morning. She has no money. If you do not hand Lily over to me, I will have this entire school shut down. I stepped forward, my heels clicking against the marble floor. Jackson and Grant flanked me, their imposing presence instantly shifting the energy in the room. You will not be shutting anything down, Patricia, I said, my voice echoing clearly through the lobby. Patricia spun around, her face contorted with rage. When she saw me, a smug, triumphant smile spread across her lips. She looked me up and down, oblivious to the 2 massive security contractors standing beside me. Well, look who decided to show up, she sneered. The unemployed accountant. I already spoke to your firm. You are finished. David is going to realize that you are a penniless burden and bring Lily back to the estate. She took a step toward me, attempting to physically push past my space to reach the secure doors leading to the classrooms. Jackson stepped smoothly into her path, crossing his arms and looking down at her with a blank, intimidating stare. Patricia gasped, taking a stumbling step backward. Who are these thugs? She shrieked, turning her wrath back to me. How did you even afford to hire them? You are broke. I am not broke, Patricia, and you are not taking my daughter anywhere, I replied, maintaining icy eye contact. You came here to cause a scene because you are desperate for control. You thought you could strip me of my livelihood and use my child as leverage. But you have made a massive miscalculation. Mrs. Higgins emerged from her office, looking relieved to see me. She walked over to the front desk, clutching a folder of enrollment documents. Patricia immediately turned her attention to the headmistress. There she is, Patricia commanded, pointing a manicured finger at me. She has no job and no income. She cannot afford the tuition here anymore. I demand you expel that child and release her to my custody. Mrs. Higgins looked at Patricia with an absolute disdain. She adjusted her glasses and opened the folder. Mrs. Crestwood, you are gravely mistaken, she said, her voice ringing with unquestionable authority. Rachel is not struggling to pay tuition. In fact, she is the anonymous lead benefactor of our entire school endowment. Her private equity firm funded the construction of our new science wing. She essentially owns the very building you are standing in. The silence that followed was absolute. Patricia's jaw went slack. The smug satisfaction melted off her face, replaced by a profound look of utter bewilderment. She stared at Mrs. Higgins, and then slowly turned her head to look at me. Her eyes darted from my tailored suit to the elite security guards, and finally to the composed expression on my face. She tried to form a sentence, but only a strangled sputtering sound escaped her lips. That is impossible. Patricia finally managed to whisper, her voice trembling. She is just an accountant. She comes from a nobody family in Chicago. She has nothing. What I have is the power to ensure you never set foot on these grounds again, I told her, taking a step closer. You came here to terrorize my child and threaten this staff. You brought your toxic behavior into a place of learning because you cannot handle the fact that your son chose us over your abusive empire. Mrs. Higgins closed the folder and signaled to the receptionist. We have already drafted the paperwork, Mrs. Crestwood. You are permanently banned from the Oak Ridge Academy property. If you ever attempt to contact our staff or come within 500 feet of this building, we will press charges for trespassing and harassment. Patricia looked like she had been struck by lightning. Her chest heaved as she struggled to draw breath. The reality of the situation was crashing down around her, but her narcissistic pride refused to let her admit defeat. This is a trick, she hissed. You are lying. You are running some sort of scam, and I am going to expose you. David will see the truth. Escort her out, I said calmly, glancing at Jackson and Grant. The two security contractors moved in perfect synchronization. They did not touch her, but their sheer size and proximity forced Patricia to walk backward toward the heavy glass doors. She stumbled over her own designer heels, her face flushed crimson with a potent mixture of rage and overwhelming humiliation. She continued to shout incomprehensible threats as they corralled her out of the lobby and onto the sidewalk. I watched her shivering in the cold winter air, looking utterly pathetic as she searched for her car. Once she was completely off the premises, Mrs. Higgins let out a long sigh of relief. I cannot apologize enough for this, Rachel. We had no idea she would attempt something so drastic. You handled it perfectly, Mrs. Higgins, I reassured her. Please make sure the security protocols remain on high alert. My mother-in-law is not a rational woman, and she is going to become much more dangerous as she loses her grip on reality. I walked down the quiet hallway to Lily's classroom. I peeked through the small window and saw my beautiful daughter sitting on a colorful rug, laughing with her friends as they built a tower out of wooden blocks. She was safe, entirely shielded from the ugly conflict her grandmother had tried to bring into her world. I felt a fierce protective instinct surge through my veins. Patricia had crossed the ultimate line by coming after my child. She had escalated this conflict from financial manipulation to a direct attack. I walked back out to the waiting SUV where Jackson held the door open for me. I slid into the leather seat and pulled out my phone. The brief satisfaction of seeing Patricia humiliated was quickly replaced by a cold, calculating focus. She would not retreat and lick her wounds. Her bruised ego would demand immediate retaliation. She had failed to take my daughter physically, so I knew she would try to take her legally. I sent a message to my legal team, putting them on standby. Patricia was escalating her rage, and I needed to be ready. The next morning, my phone buzzed before I had even finished my coffee. It was a message from my legal team, confirming that Patricia had taken the bait exactly as I anticipated. Believing she had successfully orchestrated my ruin, she was now doubling down on her attack against David. Not satisfied with merely freezing the trust fund and my supposed livelihood, she had decided to target the very foundation of our family. She had filed a formal report with Child Protective Services. According to the fabricated tip she provided, I was a violently unstable woman who was abusing my daughter out of severe financial stress. It was a vicious, calculated move designed to strip me of my child and force David to return to the Crestwood estate out of sheer desperation. I set my phone face down on the kitchen counter and took a slow breath. David was in the living room helping Lily tie her shoes before school, completely unaware of the storm brewing outside our front door. I walked over to him, my expression betraying none of the cold fury coursing through my veins. David, I need you to take Lily to school and then head straight to the university, I said, keeping my voice light and reassuring. I have some matters to handle here today. He looked up, a flicker of worry crossing his face. Are you sure you are okay, Rachel? You do not seem upset about the job at all. I smiled and kissed his cheek. I am perfectly fine. Just trust me. Once David and Lily were safely out of the driveway, I moved into action. I had prepared for this exact scenario years ago, knowing Patricia's capacity for cruelty knew no bounds. Within 20 minutes, a sleek black sedan pulled up to my curb. A woman in a tailored gray suit stepped out carrying a thick leather briefcase. Her name was Evelyn Vance, and she was one of the most ruthless family law attorneys in the state. She was a partner at a firm that exclusively handled high-net-worth divorces and elite custody disputes. I had retained her services on a generous retainer under the Vanguard Solutions corporate umbrella, ensuring she was ready to mobilize at a moment's notice. Evelyn walked into my living room, her sharp eyes taking in the modest surroundings before settling on me. "Good morning, Rachel," she said, extending her hand. "I understand your mother-in-law has decided to escalate the situation." I shook her hand firmly. "She filed a false report with CPS this morning, Evelyn. They should be arriving shortly. I need this handled with absolute precision." Evelyn opened her briefcase, pulling out a stack of pristine legal documents. "We are fully prepared," she assured me. "The countersuit for defamation, harassment, and filing a false report is already drafted. We simply need to demonstrate the malicious intent behind her actions today." We did not have to wait long. Less than an hour later, a modest sedan parked behind Evelyn's car. Two CPS investigators, a man and a woman, approached my front door with serious bureaucratic expressions. I opened the door before they could ring the bell, offering a polite, welcoming smile. "Good morning," I said. "How can I help you?" The female investigator stepped forward, flashing her identification. "Are you Rachel? We received a concerning report regarding the welfare of your daughter, Lily. We need to come inside and ask you a few questions." "Please come in," I replied, stepping aside to let them enter. Evelyn was waiting in the living room, standing tall and imposing next to the sofa. The investigators paused, clearly surprised to find a top-tier attorney waiting for them in a modest suburban home. "I am Evelyn Vance, representing Rachel in this matter," Evelyn stated, her voice ringing with authority. "My client is fully cooperating with your investigation because she has absolutely nothing to hide. In fact, we have prepared a comprehensive package of evidence for your review." The male investigator frowned, looking between Evelyn and me. "We received a tip alleging severe financial distress leading to an abusive environment," he explained, pulling a notepad from his pocket. "The caller claimed your termination from your job yesterday triggered a violent episode." Evelyn did not let him finish his sentence. She handed the female investigator a sealed flash drive. "That drive contains unedited high-definition security footage from every room in this house covering the last 48 hours," Evelyn informed them. "You will see a peaceful, loving household. You will see a family eating dinner together, reading bedtime stories and laughing. What you will not see is a single moment of distress or abuse." The investigators exchanged uncertain glances. "The caller was very specific about the financial instability," the woman noted, clutching the flash drive. Evelyn pulled a thick folder from her briefcase and dropped it onto the coffee table with a resounding thud. "That folder contains certified bank statements and financial disclosures proving my client's net worth," Evelyn stated, her tone dripping with quiet menace. "Rachel is not a destitute accountant. She is the founder and CEO of a private equity firm with assets exceeding the entire Crestwood portfolio. The report you received is a complete fabrication." I watched the realization wash over the investigators' faces. They were not dealing with a stressed, unemployed mother. They had walked into a meticulously prepared legal trap. Evelyn leaned forward, resting her hands on the table. The tip came from Patricia Crestwood, my client's mother-in-law. She is currently engaged in a malicious campaign of financial and emotional harassment against her own son and his family. I am filing a formal countersuit against her this afternoon for defamation and filing a false report. I strongly suggest your agency redirect its resources toward investigating the fraudulent nature of her claims. The investigators were speechless. They had expected a chaotic defensive environment, but instead they were facing irrefutable evidence and a formidable legal threat. We will review this footage and the financial documents immediately. The male investigator finally managed to say, his authoritative tone completely gone. If everything is as you state, we will close this case by the end of the day. As they left, Evelyn turned to me with a satisfied look and assured me the footage would end the CPS inquiry quickly. I thanked her, but my attention had already shifted back to Crestwood Estates. Patricia had crossed a line by weaponizing my daughter, yet I refused to let anger make me careless. The most important part of my strategy had already been set in motion on Christmas Eve. Vanguard Solutions had frozen Crestwood's primary credit facility the night Patricia slapped me, and the lock was still in place. I did not need to trigger it again. I only needed to make sure nobody at Vanguard softened the pressure now that William had begun calling lenders and begging for room to breathe. I opened the secure laptop from my home office safe and entered the Vanguard master dashboard. For the past 18 months, I had quietly acquired Crestwood Estates mezzanine debt through layered transactions, blind trusts, and proxy entities. William had borrowed aggressively against project values he assumed would keep rising, never bothering to learn who was buying the notes after they moved through the secondary market. By Christmas, Vanguard controlled the decisive portion of his debt stack. That was why a single command from me had been enough to lock the operating line 3 hours after we left the estate. The dashboard showed a stream of emergency requests from Crestwood's finance team. They were asking for temporary releases to cover payroll, subcontractor invoices, and equipment leases. I read every request and denied each one. Then I sent one instruction to my chief operating officer: maintain the existing hard lock, reject all grace period requests, and allow every contractual consequence of the freeze to proceed on schedule. No new action was required. The machine was already moving. I leaned back and studied the timeline. Payroll would fail first. Contractors would walk next. Once those missed payments reached the banking network, William would discover that his family name could no longer buy him emergency credit. Most important, he would finally be forced to ask the question he should have asked months earlier: who actually owned his debt? Patricia and Ashley were still wasting their energy attacking the woman they believed was a powerless accountant. Meanwhile, the consequences of the Christmas Eve freeze were about to become visible in every corner of the Crestwood empire. Across town, in his opulent corner office, William sat behind his massive oak desk, completely oblivious to the digital guillotine that had just dropped. He was sipping his morning espresso and reviewing architectural renderings for a new clubhouse when his desk phone began to ring incessantly. He answered the line, expecting a routine update from his project manager. Instead, the frantic voice of his lead site supervisor echoed through the receiver. The framing crew just packed up their trucks and walked off the job site. The supervisor shouted over the noise of heavy machinery winding down. The plumbers and electricians are packing up too. William stood up abruptly, spilling a few drops of hot coffee onto his expensive suit tie. "What are you talking about?" he demanded, his voice booming with authority. "You tell them to get back to work immediately, or I will have them blacklisted from every construction site in the state." "I cannot tell them anything," the supervisor replied, his tone shifting from panic to thinly veiled frustration. "Their payroll checks bounced this morning, William. Every single one of them. The union representative is already here, and he is threatening to file a massive lien against the property if the funds are not wired into their accounts within the hour." William stared blankly at the wall, his mind struggling to process the information. "That is impossible," he insisted. "We transferred the payroll funds from the primary credit line 2 days ago. I authorized the release myself." The supervisor let out a harsh breath. "Well, the money is not there. You need to fix this right now, or we are going to lose months of progress." William slammed the phone down and immediately dialed his chief financial officer. The call went straight to voicemail. He dialed his primary banking contact at the regional commercial bank his family had used for 3 generations. The representative, who normally greeted him with eager pleasantries, spoke with a cold, detached professionalism. William demanded to know why the payroll checks had been returned. "I am sorry, sir," the banker said, "but your entire portfolio has been flagged under a hard lock. We are legally prohibited from authorizing any disbursements." William felt a cold sweat break out on the back of his neck. He grabbed his briefcase and rushed out of the building, ordering his driver to take him directly to the financial district. For the next 4 hours, William engaged in a desperate, humiliating scramble across the city. He walked into 3 different elite financial institutions where he usually received the red carpet treatment. He requested emergency bridge loans, offering his personal commercial properties as collateral. Each time he was escorted into a private meeting room only to be met with sympathetic but firm rejections. The loan officers looked at their computer screens, their expressions hardening as they reviewed his file. "You are considered a toxic asset right now," one brave loan officer finally admitted, pushing William's application back across the table. "Someone has placed a sweeping creditor hold on your mezzanine facility. No bank in this city is going to touch your accounts until that lien is cleared. You are completely radioactive." William stumbled out of the bank, his chest heaving as he gasped for air. He pulled out his phone and dialed his chief financial officer one more time. This time the exhausted man answered. "What is happening?" William demanded, his voice cracking with unprecedented fear. "Who put a default notice on our debt?" There was a long, heavy silence on the other end of the line. The chief financial officer cleared his throat, sounding as though he had aged 10 years in a single morning. "It is Vanguard Solutions," he explained quietly. "They are a highly aggressive private equity firm. They quietly bought up our primary loans 6 months ago. They initiated a full lock on our accounts late last night, citing a technical breach in our liquidity covenant." William leaned against the brick facade of the bank, feeling his knees grow weak. Vanguard Solutions. The name meant nothing to him. It was a faceless corporate entity, a ghost in the financial machine. He had spent decades bullying smaller developers and intimidating local contractors, but he had never faced an apex predator of this magnitude. He realized with a sickening wave of nausea that his family was entirely at their mercy. He was completely unaware that the predator pulling the strings from the shadows was his own daughter-in-law. The very same woman his wife had slapped and degraded just days prior was now systematically dismantling his life's work. William ordered his driver to take him back to the Crestwood estate. He needed the quiet sanctuary of his private study to figure out how to save his legacy from absolute ruin. When he walked through the grand front doors, he was immediately accosted by Patricia. She was pacing the foyer, waving a crystal cocktail glass and ranting about her latest scheme to destroy my reputation at the local country club. They were both completely unhinged, consumed by their petty vengeance, and utterly blind to the reality of their situation. They thought their biggest problem was an accountant who refused to bow down to their authority. They did not comprehend that the foundation of their elite lifestyle was rapidly collapsing into dust. William looked at his wife, realizing she had no idea they were essentially bankrupt. The sheer volume of her complaints made his headache pound with a vicious intensity. I knew that telling her the truth would result in a catastrophic emotional breakdown. Patricia tied her entire identity to her immense wealth and her perceived superiority over everyone else in her social circle. Losing that money meant losing the only thing that made her relevant. William nodded silently, pretending to listen to her toxic complaints before making an excuse to lock himself in his study. He sat in the dark, sweating profusely, hiding the impending doom from his own family. The pressure was mounting by the minute, and he had absolutely no strategy to stop the bleeding. The banks were closing their doors and turning their backs. He picked up a framed photograph of his luxury developments and threw it fiercely across the room, watching the glass shatter against the wall. The empty frames and broken shards mirrored his failing empire perfectly, while time rapidly ran out. He realized there was no easy escape now. 3 days later, the Crestwood estate was a whirlwind of delusional extravagance. While William quietly drowned in unpaid invoices, Patricia was obsessively focused on her annual New Year charity gala. This event was a lavish spectacle held in the grand ballroom of an exclusive downtown hotel designed to showcase the immense wealth of the Crestwood name. William had weakly attempted to cancel the event citing vague cash flow concerns, but Patricia would not hear a word of it. She argued that canceling the gala would signal weakness to their elite investors. She insisted that projecting an illusion of absolute stability was the only way to maintain their social standing and attract the new capital William so desperately needed. She was entirely unaware that the capital they needed was currently being held hostage by her own daughter-in-law. Patricia sent out the embossed invitations to every influential politician and old money family in the city. She explicitly excluded David and me. She even went out of her way to inform the hotel management and her private security team that her estranged son and his unemployed wife were strictly banned from the premises. She spent her afternoons at the country club loudly whispering that David had made a tragic mistake marrying a destitute accountant and that the family had been forced to cut ties. She thought she was isolating us. She thought she was securing her kingdom. I sat in my office at Vanguard Solutions reviewing the guest list for Patricia's gala. It was a who is who of the local financial elite, including investors. William was desperately hoping to court for a bailout. Patricia wanted to use this gala to restore her shattered ego and project an image of untouchable power. It was the perfect stage for me to demonstrate how thoroughly that power had been dismantled. I called my chief operating officer and instructed him to secure a platinum corporate sponsorship for the event under the Vanguard Solutions banner. It cost a small fortune, but the donation guaranteed VIP access and a premium table right next to the event hosts. I did not put my name on the guest list. I simply registered the table under the corporate entity, ensuring Patricia would have no idea who was coming. When New Year's Eve arrived, our home was quiet and calm. I hired a trusted nanny to stay with Lily for the evening, ensuring she was safe and happily watching animated movies. I walked into our bedroom carrying a heavy garment bag I had picked up from a private designer downtown. David was sitting on the edge of the bed wearing a sharp black tuxedo he had owned since graduate school. He looked incredibly handsome, but the tension in his shoulders was obvious. I was still processing his family's betrayal and the financial power I had revealed to him. I unzipped the garment bag and pulled out a custom haute couture gown. It was a striking emerald green silk that draped perfectly, brushing the floor with dangerous elegance. I paired it with a vintage diamond necklace I had purchased from a private auction. When I stepped out of the bathroom fully dressed, David stood up, his breath catching in his throat. "You look absolutely incredible," he whispered, taking my hands. "But Rachel, are you sure we should do this? Showing up at her event is going to cause a massive scene. She is going to humiliate us." I met his worried gaze with absolute certainty. "She is going to try, David," I agreed softly, "but she is not going to succeed. Tonight is not about causing a scene. It is about showing your parents that their actions have consequences and that we are no longer playing by their rules. I need you to trust me and stand by my side." He took a deep breath, his posture straightening as he absorbed my confidence. "I trust you," he said firmly. "Let us go." Our black car pulled up to the valet stand of the downtown hotel just as the gala was reaching its peak. The lobby was a sea of designer tuxedos and sparkling evening gowns. A string quartet played softly in the corner, while waitstaff circulated with champagne. David offered me his arm, and we walked through the gilded entrance together. The sheer opulence of the event was staggering, a stark contrast to the financial ruin looming over the hosts. We approached the main ballroom entrance, where a team of event coordinators and hotel security stood with digital guest lists. When we reached the front of the line, a young woman with a clipboard looked up. Her polite smile faltered for a fraction of a second as she recognized David. "I am sorry, Mr. Crestwood," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Your mother left very specific instructions that you were not on the guest list tonight. I have to ask you to step aside." I did not give David a chance to respond. I stepped forward and handed the coordinator our platinum sponsor credentials. "We are not here under a personal invitation," I informed her, my voice ringing with professional authority. "We are representing Vanguard Solutions. We are the lead corporate sponsors for this evening's charity auction." The coordinator's eyes widened as she scanned the heavy embossed card and verified the credentials on her tablet. The Vanguard Solutions sponsorship was the largest single donation the charity had received all year. She immediately stepped back, pulling the velvet rope aside with a frantic apology. "I am so sorry for the confusion, Mom. Please right this way. Your table is right near the front stage." We walked into the ballroom, the massive crystal chandeliers casting a warm golden light over the seated guests. I guided David toward the front of the room, moving with a slow, deliberate grace. As we navigated through the sea of tables, I could feel the shift in the room's energy. Heads turned, whispers rippled through the crowd. People recognized David, but they did not recognize the confident, radiant woman walking beside him, draped in diamonds that cost more than their luxury vehicles. Patricia was standing near the main stage, holding a glass of champagne, and holding court with a group of wealthy socialites. She was wearing a heavily beaded silver gown, her face glowing with the attention of her peers. William stood a few feet away, looking pale and dehydrated as he desperately pitched a real estate venture to an aloof hedge fund manager. I intentionally steered us right past Patricia's group. She was in the middle of a haughty laugh when her eyes locked onto me. The sound died in her throat. Her champagne glass tilted precariously, spilling a few drops of wine onto her silver dress. Her jaw clenched as her gaze darted from my custom emerald gown to the diamonds resting against my collarbone, and finally to the composed, protective stance David held beside me. The illusion of her perfect evening shattered instantly. Patricia's face contorted into a mask of pure hatred. She could not fathom how the unemployed accountant she had slapped and banned had somehow bypassed her strict security and walked into her exclusive gala looking like royalty. Her bruised ego demanded immediate retaliation. She slammed her glass down onto a waiter's tray and signaled aggressively to the head of hotel security standing near the exit. I watched her point, a shaking, furious finger directly at my face, her mouth moving in harsh, desperate commands. She was ordering them to physically bounce us from the center of the ballroom. She desperately wanted the elite crowd to watch us being dragged out into the freezing cold night, aiming for a highly public humiliation to completely restore her shattered dominance. The two burly security guards nodded in agreement and began marching across the polished ballroom floor, their faces grim and determined. David tensed beside me, his hand tightening protectively around mine. I simply smiled and waited. The two security guards moved with the heavy, purposeful strides of men who were used to handling uncomfortable situations quickly and quietly. They navigated through the sea of designer gowns and tailored tuxedos, keeping their eyes locked squarely on David and me. David shifted his weight, his posture defensive as he prepared for a physical confrontation that I knew would never happen. I reached out and gently rested my fingertips against his forearm, signaling him to remain calm. The murmurs in the ballroom began to swell as the surrounding guests noticed the impending spectacle. Patricia stood a few yards away, her chin raised in triumph, her eyes gleaming with the anticipation of my public ruin. She wanted a show, and she was fully prepared to sacrifice her own son's dignity, just to watch me get dragged out into the freezing winter night. The guards were less than 10 feet away when a sudden dramatic shift in the atmosphere swept through the grand ballroom. It was the kind of palpable change in energy that only occurs when true power enters a room. The string quartet abruptly stopped playing mid-measure, leaving a heavy, expectant silence hanging in the air. A flurry of movement near the grand mahogany entrance doors drew everyone's attention away from us. Even the security guards paused, glancing over their massive shoulders to see what was causing the commotion. Harrison Caldwell had arrived. Harrison was a legendary figure in the commercial real estate world, an undisputed billionaire whose investment portfolio could single-handedly dictate the economic future of the entire city. He was the white whale Patricia had been desperately trying to court for the past 6 months. She had sent him lavish gifts, invited him to exclusive country club dinners, and practically begged his assistance for a 5-minute meeting, all in a frantic bid to secure a bailout for Crestwood Estates. Until this very second, he had ignored every single one of her desperate pleas. When Patricia saw Harrison step into the ballroom, the vindictive sneer vanished from her face, instantly replaced by a mask of desperate fawning hospitality. She completely forgot about me and the security guards. She thrust her champagne glass into the hands of a startled waiter and practically sprinted across the polished floor, her silver-beaded gown sparkling under the chandeliers. Harrison, she called out, her voice, pitched to a sickeningly sweet frequency that carried clearly across the silent room. I am so incredibly honored that you could join us tonight. We have a premium table reserved right at the front for you. She reached out her hands, eager to embrace him, or at least pull him into the spotlight she so desperately craved. Harrison did not even slow his stride. He did not extend his hand. He did not even look at her. He bypassed Patricia, entirely leaving her standing with her arms outstretched in empty air, her fake smile freezing into a mask of pure shock. He walked past her as if she were nothing more than a minor obstacle in his path. The collective gasp from the surrounding socialites was audible. Harrison kept walking, moving with absolute purpose toward the front of the room. He walked straight up to the table where David and I were standing. The two security guards who had been moments away from grabbing my arms now stumbled backward, retreating into the shadows of the floral arrangements. They realized instantly that anyone Harrison Caldwell approached with such singular focus was not someone they could touch. Harrison stopped in front of me and extended his hand, a genuine warm smile transforming his serious face. "Rachel," he said, his deep voice booming with absolute respect. "It is an absolute privilege to finally meet you in person." I took his hand, offering a firm professional handshake. "The pleasure is entirely mine, Harrison," I replied, my tone matching his confidence. "I wanted to find you before the speeches began," he continued, making sure his voice carried to the wealthy guests eagerly eavesdropping around us. "I need to personally thank you for Vanguard Solutions' recent merger with our commercial portfolio. Your strategic vision last quarter was nothing short of brilliant. You navigated that acquisition flawlessly, and you saved my holding company millions in the process. The real estate sector in this city desperately needs leadership like yours." The ballroom was so quiet you could hear a pin drop. The words "Vanguard Solutions" hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. Every prominent investor, politician, and socialite in the room processed the information simultaneously. The woman Patricia had been loudly slandering all evening, calling her a destitute, unemployed accountant, was not a charity case. She was the chief executive of the most aggressive and successful private equity firm to enter the city in a decade. "I appreciate the kind words, Harrison," I told him, maintaining my calm demeanor. "Vanguard is very selective about our partnerships, but we see immense value in collaborating with institutions that understand modern market dynamics. We are looking forward to a highly profitable relationship." Harrison chuckled, clearly pleased. "I have no doubt we will thrive," he said before turning his attention to David. He extended his hand again. "You must be David. Rachel has mentioned your incredible work in the history department. It takes a very strong man to stand beside a woman with this much power." David shook his hand, a proud smile breaking across his face. "I am just lucky she tolerates me," David joked smoothly, leaning into the reality of our dynamic with total ease. The interaction lasted less than 3 minutes, but it completely rewrote the social hierarchy of the entire room. Harrison excused himself to speak with the charity organizers, promising to connect with my office on Monday morning. The moment he walked away, the dam broke. The elite crowd, who just minutes ago had been whispering cruel jokes and avoiding our table, suddenly swarmed us. It was a pathetic display of high society survival instincts. Bank presidents who had previously ignored David now pushed through the crowd to offer me their business cards. Wealthy investors complimented my custom emerald gown and asked if Vanguard Solutions was accepting new capital applications. They gravitated toward me like moths to a flame, eager to align themselves with the new apex predator in the room. I smiled graciously, shaking hands and accepting compliments while giving them absolutely nothing of substance. I let them bask in the glow of my newfound status, ensuring every single interaction was highly visible to the woman standing alone across the room. I looked over the heads of the sycophants and found Patricia. She was standing in the exact spot where Harrison had bypassed her. She looked entirely broken. The vibrant, arrogant energy that usually animated her every movement had evaporated. Her shoulders sagged, and her perfectly styled hair suddenly looked harsh against her pale, slack face. She was clutching a new glass of champagne, but her hand trembled so violently the golden liquid sloshed over the rim, dripping onto the expensive fabric of her dress. She could not comprehend what had just happened. Her mind, an echo chamber of generational entitlement and class supremacy, was desperately trying to process the reality that the woman she called trash was actually standing at the very top of the financial food chain. She had orchestrated this entire elaborate gala to humiliate me, and instead I had effortlessly dethroned her without raising my voice or lifting a finger. A few feet away from Patricia stood William. His reaction was far more visceral. He had heard Vanguard Solutions ring across the silent ballroom. He stared at me, his eyes wide with a horrifying realization. He finally understood that his family was not the victim of a random market fluctuation. They were the targets of a highly personal, meticulously planned execution. The psychological warfare was complete. Now all that remained was the financial slaughter waiting for them on Monday morning. Monday morning arrived with a hard gray sky over Boston and the kind of cold that made the city look carved from steel. At 8 o'clock sharp, the legal department at Vanguard Solutions released the document William had been dreading without knowing its exact form. It was titled, Notice of Immediate Default and Acceleration. The notice did more than maintain the operating freeze that had already strangled Crestwood Estates through the weekend. It formally declared the company in default across the debt portfolio. Vanguard controlled, accelerated the outstanding obligations, and authorized enforcement against the properties pledged as collateral. Copies went simultaneously to Crestwood's chief financial officer, its outside counsel, the title companies connected to its active developments, and every bank still monitoring Williams' accounts. I was already in my Vanguard office when the delivery confirmations began appearing on my screen. I did not celebrate. I simply watched the system do exactly what it had been designed to do. The Christmas Eve hardlock had exposed how dependent Crestwood was on constant borrowed cash. This notice converted that weakness into a legal collapse. One by one, the active development files on my dashboard changed status. Disbursement restricted became default enforcement. Default enforcement became foreclosure review. The flagship residential project William had once called his legacy was first in line. Across town, the Crestwood headquarters erupted into chaos. William arrived before most of his staff, still wearing the same exhausted expression he had carried through the gala. The elevator doors opened onto a floor already buzzing with panicked voices. Phones rang without pause. Employees moved between offices carrying folders and printed notices. His chief financial officer met him outside the conference room holding a thick packet from Vanguard. This is not another temporary hold, the man warned. They have accelerated the debt. They are moving against the collateral. William snatched the packet and read the first page while walking. His eyes stopped on the foreclosure language. He read it again, slower this time, as though the words might rearrange themselves into something survivable. They did not. Vanguard had initiated enforcement proceedings on multiple active sites. Any property tied to the mezzanine facility could now be seized or forced into a sale if Crestwood failed to cure the default under the terms of the agreements. Stop them, William barked. File an injunction. Challenge the covenant. Do something. We are reviewing every option, the chief financial officer replied, but the documents are clean. They bought the debt legally. The liquidity breach is documented. We missed payroll, subcontractor payments, and reserve requirements. Every lender we contacted has refused to refinance us. Unless Vanguard voluntarily gives us time, there is no quick cure. William stormed into the main conference room, where stacks of unpaid invoices covered the polished table. A project manager was on speakerphone reporting that another subcontractor had removed equipment from a job site. A title representative had emailed notice that a pending property sale could not close because Vanguard's enforcement claim now clouded the transaction. The company was no longer merely short of cash. Its assets were becoming unusable one by one. For the first time, William understood the difference between being wealthy and being liquid. On paper, Crestwood still controlled buildings, land, and half-completed developments worth millions. In practice, he could not sell, refinance, or borrow against them quickly enough to stop the collapse. Every asset he tried to reach was tied to a loan alien or a covenant that Vanguard now controlled. He shut himself inside his office and began calling people who had once treated his name like a password. Bank presidents sent him to voicemail. A developer who had begged for his partnership 6 months earlier suddenly claimed he was in a meeting. An attorney William knew socially listened to the situation and then told him there was no magical procedural trick that could erase a valid default. Each failed call stripped away another layer of his confidence. Near noon, he stared at his phone and finally selected David's number. David answered after several rings. His voice was cautious. "What do you want, Dad?" William closed his eyes. The question would once have offended him. Now he was too frightened to care. "David, I need your help. This has gone beyond the credit freeze. Vanguard issued a formal immediate default this morning. They are starting foreclosure proceedings against the development sites. If this continues, we will lose the company." There was a short silence on the line. David did not sound surprised. "After everything that happened, why are you calling me?" "Because you work in the university," William said quickly. "You know people. The law school has professors who consult on commercial cases. The business school has connections to lenders and restructuring specialists. I need you to call anyone who can find a loophole. There has to be a way to challenge the acceleration or delay the foreclosures long enough for me to raise capital." David's voice hardened. "You are asking me to use my university to rescue the business that funded the woman who assaulted my wife and called my daughter trash." William pressed his fingers against his forehead. "I am asking you to think about your family. Crestwood is your inheritance too. If the company disappears, everything your grandparents built disappears with it." "My family is Rachel and Lily," David replied. "You made that very clear on Christmas Eve." William pushed out of his chair and began pacing. "David, please. I know your mother was wrong. I know she went too far. We can deal with that later. Right now, I need a legal opening. Just make one call. Ask one professor. Ask somebody at the University Foundation. There are people there who understand debt law and nonprofit finance. Give me a name." David let out a slow breath. "Dad, even if I knew someone who could help, I would not drag them into this. You spent years building a company on leverage and fear. Mom spent years using money to control everyone around her. Now the money is gone and you are calling me because you think I am still supposed to obey." "That is not fair!" William snapped, a flash of his old arrogance breaking through the panic. "I paid for your education. I funded your life. I put money into that trust so you could become a professor instead of joining the company. And Mom froze that trust the minute I protected my wife," David answered. "So do not pretend it was a gift. It was a leash." William stopped pacing. The office beyond his closed door sounded like a disaster zone. A phone rang, unanswered. Someone raised their voice in the hallway about another returned payment. William lowered his tone until it became almost a whisper. "Son, if you do nothing, we could lose everything." David was quiet for several seconds. Then he said, "You should have thought about that before you treated my family like something disposable." William swallowed. "David." "No, Dad. I am done saving people who would not protect my wife and daughter for one night. Do not call me about Crestwood again." The line went dead. William remained standing in the middle of his office with the phone pressed to his ear. He slowly lowered it and stared at the blank screen. There would be no university connection, no obedient son, and no last-minute rescue hidden inside the family trust. Outside his office, the company continued coming apart in real time. Another email arrived confirming that a foreclosure review had been opened on a second development. Then another notice followed regarding equipment collateral. Back at Vanguard, I watched the enforcement dashboard update without touching a single control. The walls were closing in exactly as the contracts allowed. William had spent his life believing influence could bend every rule in his favor. Monday morning taught him that contracts did not care about his surname, and neither did I that morning. The morning sun pierced the sheer silk curtains of Ashley's penthouse apartment. She woke with a headache, a consequence of the champagne consumed at the charity gala the night before. She lay in bed rationalizing the horrific humiliation her family had endured. Rachel's sudden display of power was nothing more than a fluke. Ashley convinced herself William was experiencing a minor cash flow issue, and Patricia would inevitably crush Rachel to restore order. She refused to believe an accountant could dethrone the Crestwood legacy. Her worldview rested on elitism and denial. She pushed the unsettling memories away, focusing on the only thing that mattered to her: her luxury lifestyle brand. For 3 years, Ashley operated a high-end boutique in the most affluent shopping district. She sold overpriced home goods, organic skincare, and bespoke loungewear. It was a vanity project funded by an investment group her father strong-armed into supporting her. Ashley treated the boutique like a personal kingdom, playing the visionary entrepreneur while ignoring accounting principles. She spent days hosting exclusive shopping events for wealthy friends, oblivious that operating costs massively outweighed her sales revenue. She slipped into a designer trench coat and grabbed her keys. She was eager to get to the store and finalize window displays for her winter collection. She needed the distraction of her curated world to wash away the bitter taste of defeat. Ashley drove her luxury sports car downtown, providing warmth against the winter chill. She pulled up to the curb expecting to see employees preparing the floor for the morning rush. Instead, she was met with a scene that made her stomach drop. The heavy glass doors of her boutique were dark and locked. The custom lighting was off, leaving the interior hollow and abandoned. She stepped out of her car, her heels clicking against the pavement. Confusion washed over her as she approached the entrance. A steel padlock hung from the brass door handles. Ashley reached out her hands, trembling as she grabbed the cold metal lock. She tugged at it, assuming it was a mistake made by the property management. Her eyes darted to an orange piece of paper taped to the glass door. It was a legal document bearing the seal of the city court. She leaned closer, her breath fogging the glass as she read the bold black text. It was an immediate notice of eviction and asset seizure. The document stated, the commercial lease was in severe default, and the property owners had reclaimed the premises. All inventory inside the store was frozen to cover months of unpaid rent. Panic spread across Ashley's chest. This was impossible. She pulled out her phone, her hands shaking so violently she nearly dropped the device. She dialed her store manager, ready to scream about this mix-up. The call went to an automated voicemail stating the number was no longer in service. She dialed her assistant and received the same dead tone. The isolation was immediate and terrifying. She stood on the busy sidewalk, watching pedestrians cast curious glances at the woman frantically pulling at a padlocked door. The protective bubble she lived inside was popping, exposing her to a harsh reality she was unequipped to handle. Desperation fueled her next move. Ashley scrolled through her contacts, finding the number for her primary silent investor, a financial manager named Mr. Cole. He represented the holding company that provided the initial capital for her brand. She pressed the call button, pacing on the icy sidewalk. She was ready to demand an infusion of cash to clear up this clerical error. The phone rang 3 times before Mr. Cole finally answered. His voice lacked the deferential warmth he usually reserved for the Crestwood family. It was flat, cold, and strictly professional. "Mr. Cole, you need to fix this right now," Ashley demanded, her voice shrill. "I just arrived at my store and the property management company has padlocked the doors. There is an eviction notice taped to the glass. Wire the operational funds to cover the lease immediately, and I want the building manager fired for this disrespect. Do you hear me?" There was a long, heavy sigh on the other end of the line. "Ashley, I recommend you lower your voice and listen to me carefully," Mr. Cole stated, his tone devoid of sympathy. "I am not wiring you a single cent. Our investment fund has divested from your brand. We cut our losses and severed all financial ties late last night. Your company is entirely bankrupt." Ashley stopped pacing, her heart hammered against her ribs. "What are you talking about?" she shrieked. "You cannot divest. My father brought you into this deal. He guaranteed your returns. You are contractually obligated to fund my operational costs until we hit our targets." Mr. Cole let out a dry, humorless laugh. "Your profitability targets were a complete joke, Ashley. Your vanity project has been bleeding cash since you opened those doors. We kept the lights on because your father was quietly subsidizing your losses through Crestwood Estates. He funneled money from construction loans to cover your rent and payroll to keep you occupied. You do not have a real business. You have an incredibly expensive hobby. The words hit Ashley like a physical blow, knocking the wind from her lungs. My father subsidized the store, she whispered, the horrible truth slowly sinking in. Yes, Mr. Cole confirmed bluntly. And as of this morning, your father is facing total financial ruin. A private equity firm named Vanguard Solutions called in every debt tied to Crestwood. His assets are completely frozen. When the money stopped flowing from his accounts, your brand instantly collapsed. We executed our exit clause the second we received the market alert. You have zero capital, Ashley. You have no inventory. You have no staff. Your business is dead and never existed in the first place. Ashley stood paralyzed on the sidewalk, the phone pressed against her ear. She heard Mr. Cole breathing on the other end, but she had nothing to say. The grand illusion she built her identity around was shattering into jagged pieces. She was not a brilliant entrepreneur. She was not a businesswoman. She was a spoiled child playing dress-up with stolen money. Now that the money was gone, the costume had been ripped away. I am hanging up now, Ashley, Mr. Cole said, carrying a note of dismissal. Do not call this office again. The line went dead. Ashley slowly lowered the phone. The city around her faded into a muffled roar. She looked at the padlocked door, staring at the empty space inside. The beautiful displays, the imported silk garments, the curated aesthetic was gone. It belonged to the creditors now. She stepped backward, her trembling legs no longer able to support her weight. She collapsed onto the cold pavement, oblivious to the stares of morning commuters walking past her. She pulled her knees to her chest, wrapping her arms around herself as sobs tore through her throat. Tears streamed down her face, ruining her makeup and staining the collar of her coat. For 30 years she navigated the world with absolute superiority, believing she was inherently better than everyone else because of her last name. She mocked Rachel for working for a living. She threw handmade gifts into the trash because she felt entitled to the finest luxuries. She built her entire self-worth on family wealth. Sitting on the freezing concrete, she was forced to confront the pathetic reality of her existence. She had no actual business skills. She had no real friends. She had no means of survival. Without William's corrupt empire, she was useless. The arrogant pride that defined her entire life evaporated, leaving behind a hollow, terrified shell of a woman. She buried her face in her hands, sobbing into the cold winter air. The golden child of the Crestwood family was finally broken, completely destroyed by her own relentless incompetence. While Ashley sat weeping on the icy sidewalk, the architect of her misery was pacing the floors of the Crestwood estate in a state of absolute frenzy. Patricia had spent the morning screaming at her husband, demanding to know why their credit cards were declining and why the household staff had suddenly quit. William had locked himself in his study, unable to face his wife's wrath, leaving Patricia to spiral into a blind panic. She knew they needed liquid assets immediately to save face and keep the facade of their wealth intact. Her mind raced through their portfolio, searching for something she could sell quickly without William's authorization. That was when she remembered the modest suburban house David and Rachel lived in. In Patricia's mind, that house was a piece of Crestwood property held under the family trust that she co-managed. She convinced herself that evicting her own son and selling the house out from under him would solve two problems at once. It would provide a quick infusion of cash to cover their immediate social obligations, and it would finally render Rachel homeless, forcing David to crawl back to the estate. It was a ruthless maneuver born of pure desperation and vindictive pride. Patricia wasted no time. She marched into her dressing room and selected a sharp, tailored blazer and her most intimidating heels, determined to project absolute authority. She picked up her phone and dialed a high-end real estate agent she frequently used for luxury listings. She instructed the agent to meet her at David's address, immediately claiming she was ready to put a prime piece of trust property on the market for a quick cash sale. The drive to our neighborhood took her less than 40 minutes. I was sitting at my kitchen island, reviewing the latest financial reports from Vanguard Solutions, when I saw her silver luxury sedan pull up to the curb. Another car parked right behind it, and a woman in a professional business suit stepped out carrying a clipboard and a sleek leather folio. I watched through the window as Patricia greeted the real estate agent, her posture radiating a smug, toxic confidence. She pointed at my house, gesturing to the roof and the landscaping, clearly discussing listing prices and curb appeal. She marched up the front walkway, her heels clicking aggressively against the concrete. She did not bother to knock. Instead, she pounded her fist against the solid wood of my front door, demanding immediate attention. David was at the university teaching an afternoon seminar, and Lily was at school, leaving me entirely alone to handle Patricia's latest desperate attack. I closed my laptop, slid it into its hidden compartment, and walked slowly toward the foyer. I opened the door to find Patricia standing with her hands on her hips, wearing a triumphant sneer that looked completely absurd, given her actual financial reality. The real estate agent stood slightly behind her, offering a polite but somewhat uncomfortable smile. "Rachel," Patricia barked, her voice echoing into my quiet entryway. "You need to pack your things immediately. I am putting this property on the market today, and I want you out by the end of the week." I leaned against the doorframe, maintaining a perfectly serene expression. "Good afternoon, Patricia," I replied, keeping my tone light and conversational. "It is a bit chilly out here. Why do you not step inside for a moment? It seems we have a few things to discuss before you start taking listing photos." Patricia let out a harsh, mocking laugh. "We have absolutely nothing to discuss," she declared, stepping over the threshold and into my foyer. She gestured for the real estate agent to follow her inside. "This house belongs to the Crestwood Family Trust. Since David has foolishly decided to abandon his family responsibilities, the trust is reclaiming its assets. You are currently occupying our property, and I am legally evicting you. You can take your cheap furniture with you, but I want you gone." She turned to the real estate agent, waving her hand toward the living room. "As you can see, the interior is quite modest, but the lot size is excellent. We are looking for a quick cash buyer. We are willing to list it slightly below market value if it guarantees a closing within 2 weeks." The agent nodded, pulling a pen from her folio. "It is a lovely neighborhood, Mrs. Crestwood," she said professionally. "I will need to verify the trust documentation and the deed before we can officially list the property, but I am confident we can find a buyer very quickly." I watched Patricia bask in her own delusion. She genuinely believed she was holding the ultimate trump card. She thought she was rendering me homeless and punishing her son with a single masterful stroke. Her arrogance was blinding her to the fact that I was not reacting with panic or tears. I simply stood there, letting her finish her grand performance. When she finally paused to catch her breath, I turned my attention to the real estate agent. "I am sorry you had to drive all the way out here today," I told the woman, my voice filled with genuine sympathy. "My mother-in-law seems to be a bit confused about her asset portfolio. I am afraid this house is not for sale." Patricia whipped her head around, her eyes flashing with renewed fury. "Do not listen to her," she snapped at the agent. "She is just a bitter, unemployed accountant who refuses to accept reality. The trust owns this home, and I control the trust." I smiled warmly at Patricia before turning to a small antique console table in the hallway. "Let me save you the trouble of running a title search," I said, opening the top drawer. I retrieved a thick manila envelope that I kept for my own personal records. I pulled out a certified copy of the property deed and handed it directly to the real estate agent. She took the document, her eyes scanning the legal text. I watched her expression shift from professional courtesy to utter shock. The agent cleared her throat, shifting her weight uncomfortably. "Mrs. Crestwood," she said, her voice dropping to a hesitant whisper. "This deed is not in the name of the Crestwood Family Trust. The property is owned outright by a private limited liability company." Patricia snatched the document from the agent's hands, ripping it so hard the paper nearly tore in half. She stared at the bold black ink, her eyes tracing the name of the holding company. "What is this garbage?" she demanded, her voice rising in pitch. "This is a forgery. William put this house in the trust years ago when David first moved in." "He certainly did," I agreed, folding my arms across my chest. "But 2 years ago, William made some very poor investments. He quietly needed a massive cash injection to cover a margin call that he did not want you to know about. He liquidated several smaller trust assets to generate capital. This house was one of them." I paused, letting the reality of her husband's financial deceptions sink into her mind. "I purchased this property directly from the trust using one of my shell corporations," I explained slowly, so she would not miss a single detail. David does not even know I own it yet. I bought it to ensure that my daughter would always have a secure home, no matter how reckless your family became with your wealth. You do not own the walls around you, Patricia. I do. The real estate agent hastily backed away from Patricia, taking her deed copy back. I am so sorry for the intrusion, she mumbled, before practically sprinting out the front door and escaping to her car. Patricia stood frozen on my welcome mat, utterly defeated. She had no power here. Get off my porch, I commanded. She turned and walked away. I watched her silver sedan pull away from the curb. The victory on my porch was satisfying, but it was merely a prelude. I closed the front door and walked back into my kitchen. I retrieved my secure laptop from its hidden compartment and opened my email client. Patricia had played her final hand and failed. It was time to deliver the killing blow. I drafted a directive to my legal and financial teams at Vanguard Solutions in Manhattan. I authorized them to send the final communication to William. They had exactly 48 hours before the corporate guillotine severed the Crestwood empire for good. I pressed send, closed the laptop, and went to make a fresh pot of coffee. The trap was meticulously set, and the bait was irresistible. Back at the sprawling Crestwood estate, the atmosphere had deteriorated from panicked chaos into a suffocating silence. William sat alone in his darkened study, surrounded by stacks of financial ledgers and bank notices. The air in the room was heavy with the scent of old leather. He had spent the last 2 days trying to leverage every connection he had cultivated over a 30-year career. Every single door had been slammed in his face. The word was out on the street. Crestwood Estates was toxic. The aggressive freeze initiated by Vanguard Solutions had triggered a domino effect across his entire portfolio. Subcontractors had filed liens against his flagship development projects. Creditors were preparing to seize the machinery sitting idle on his construction sites. But the impending bankruptcy was not the worst of his problems. William stared at a red folder sitting on his desk. It contained the shadow ledgers. For the past 5 years, he had been moving money illegally, inflating asset valuations to secure commercial loans, and shuffling trust funds to cover his operational losses. It was textbook financial fraud. If Vanguard Solutions forced a liquidation, the accountants would tear through his books in a matter of hours. The paper trail was undeniable. I was not just looking at losing his mansion and his country club memberships. He was looking at federal prison. The harsh reality of spending his years in a concrete cell made his chest tighten with anxiety. He rubbed his eyes, praying for a miracle he knew he did not deserve. A sharp chime from his computer broke the silence. William flinched, his hand trembling as he reached for the mouse. An email had just arrived in his inbox. The sender address belonged to the legal division of Vanguard Solutions. He clicked open the message, his heart pounding against his ribs. The email was cold, formal, and devoid of any pleasantries. It stated that Vanguard Solutions was fully aware of the financial discrepancies hidden within the Crestwood accounts. The firm indicated they possessed enough evidence of fraudulent accounting practices to involve the Securities and Exchange Commission. However, the message offered a single sliver of hope. Vanguard was willing to discuss a debt restructuring plan. If an agreement could be reached, the firm would absorb the toxic debt and keep the matter out of federal court. There was one non-negotiable condition attached to the offer. William and the stakeholders of the Crestwood Trust had to appear in person at the Vanguard Solutions headquarters in Manhattan the next morning. They were required to present their plea for mercy directly to the executive officer. If they failed to arrive by 10 o'clock, the authorities would receive the files and Crestwood would be forced into liquidation. William read the email 3 times, his mind racing. It was a lifeline wrapped in barbed wire. This executive was demanding that they travel to New York and beg for their survival. It was the ultimate power play, an exercise in dominance. But William had no leverage left. He printed the email, his hands shaking, and walked out of his study. He found Ashley sitting on the sofa, crying into a throw pillow. She had been inconsolable since discovering her boutique had been padlocked and seized by her creditors. Her makeup was smeared across her face, a contrast to her presentation. A moment later, the front door swung open and Patricia stumbled into the foyer. She looked disheveled. Her blazer was wrinkled and her arrogant posture had collapsed. She had just returned from her defeat on my front porch, realizing she could not even evict the daughter-in-law she despised. Patricia dropped her purse onto the floor and leaned against the wall, gasping for breath. She looked at William, her eyes with panic and defeat. "She knows," Patricia whispered, her voice trembling. "Rachel knows about the trust. She bought the house. We have nothing left to sell, William. We are out of options." William walked over to his wife and daughter, holding the email in his hand. He looked at the two women who had spent their lives treating everyone around them like garbage. Their arrogance had been burned away, leaving nothing but fear. "We have one option left," William said, his voice uncompromising. He dropped the email onto the coffee table in front of Ashley. "Vanguard Solutions just reached out to me. They know about the ledgers. They know about the fraud. They are threatening to hand the files over to the authorities tomorrow morning." Patricia gasped, her hand flying to her throat. "Federal authorities," she repeated the words, tasting like ash in her mouth. "William, you promised me those accounts were secure. I promised you a lifestyle we could no longer afford, and you refused to stop spending." William snapped, his patience exhausted. "I moved that money to keep this family afloat, and now we are caught. But this firm is offering us a meeting to restructure the debt and keep us out of a penitentiary." Ashley looked up from her pillow, her eyes swollen. "Who is the executive?" she asked, her voice shaking. "I do not know," William admitted. "Some corporate raider who wants to watch us beg. And that is what we are going to do. The meeting is tomorrow morning at their headquarters." Patricia shook her head, stepping backward. "I am not going to New York to beg a stranger for money. I am Patricia Crestwood. I do not grovel." "You will do exactly as I say!" William roared, the explosion of anger making both women flinch. "You do not seem to understand the reality of our situation, Patricia. We are 2 days away from prison. You will lose this house. You will lose your clothes, your jewelry, your friends, and your freedom. You will be trading your country club for a prison. So you will march upstairs now, and you will pack a bag. We are driving to Manhattan tonight." Ashley let out a wail of despair, burying her face into the pillow. "Get up," William commanded, kicking the leg of the sofa. "Both of you, go pack your things now. We are leaving in 1 hour." Patricia stared at her husband, recognizing the terror behind his anger. The illusion they had protected was over. She slowly nodded her shoulders, slumping in defeat, as the reality of their bankruptcy settled into her bones. She turned and walked up the staircase, her footsteps slow and reluctant. Ashley followed behind her, still weeping softly over the loss of her identity and status. William stood alone in the foyer of the mansion he could not afford. He looked around at the chandeliers, the marble floors, and the artwork lining the walls. It all felt like a tomb closing in around him. He turned and walked back to his study to gather the fraudulent financial records they would need for the morning meeting. They were going to walk right into the cold, unforgiving lion's den, completely blind, hoping that the powerful unknown billionaire sitting at the top of the tall glass tower would show them a mercy they had never ever shown to anyone else in their entire privileged lives. The drive from Boston to Manhattan had been a silent, agonizing march toward their own execution. The black town car pulled up to the curb outside a massive glass and steel skyscraper in the heart of the financial district. Williams stepped out onto the freezing pavement, looking up at the sheer vertical drop of the Vanguard Solutions headquarters. The building scraped the gray winter sky, a towering monument to the kind of absolute institutional power he had always pretended to wield, but never truly possessed. He reached back into the car and pulled out a heavy leather briefcase stuffed with desperate financial projections, forged ledgers, and whatever pathetic collateral he could scrape together to offer as tribute. Ashley slid out of the back seat next, her eyes hidden behind oversized dark sunglasses to conceal the redness of her swollen eyelids. She wore a tailored wool coat from 3 seasons ago, pulling it tightly around her waist to ward off the biting wind. Finally, Patricia emerged from the vehicle. She stepped onto the busy Manhattan sidewalk and immediately bumped into a rushing commuter who simply shoved past her without a second glance. In her insulated suburban kingdom, people parted like the Red Sea when Patricia Crestwood walked into a room. Here, on the ruthless streets of New York, she was absolutely nothing. She adjusted the collar of her charcoal suit, trying to summon the haughty arrogance that had fueled her entire existence. but the tailored fabric felt like armor that had already been breached. The three of them stood huddled together on the sidewalk, looking less like a dynasty of elite real estate moguls, and more like a family of refugees begging for asylum. William did not offer his wife his arm. He simply turned and walked through the heavy revolving doors, leaving Patricia and Ashley to hurry after him. The lobby of the Vanguard building was a sprawling cavern of white marble and brushed steel, designed specifically to make visitors feel small and insignificant. It lacked the ornate warmth of the country clubs Patricia frequented. It was cold, sterile, and relentlessly efficient. A massive digital ticker tape wrapped around the upper mezzanine displaying global market fluctuations in real time. William approached the main reception desk, where three security officers in sharp black suits stood behind a raised marble counter. He cleared his throat, trying to project a confident, authoritative tone that completely failed him. "Good morning, William," said his voice cracking slightly. "I am William Crestwood. I have a scheduled meeting with your chief executive officer regarding a debt restructuring portfolio." The head security officer did not smile. He did not look impressed by the Crestwood name. He simply tapped a few keys on his sleek computer terminal and looked back up with blank, dead eyes. "I need government-issued identification from all three of you," the officer demanded, extending a flat plastic tray across the marble counter. Patricia gasped, placing a hand against her chest. "Excuse me," she snapped, her old instincts flaring up. "Do you have any idea who we are? We are expected upstairs immediately. We do not have time to stand here and be interrogated by lobby staff. Call your superiors and tell them the Crestwood family has arrived." The security officer did not even blink. "Madam, if you do not place your identification in the tray, I will call the building guards to have you escorted back out to the street," he stated, his voice devoid of any emotion. "You do not go up to the executive floors until you pass the screening protocol. Now IDs, please." William aggressively grabbed Patricia's arm, squeezing it hard enough to make her wince. "Shut your mouth and give him your license," William hissed through gritted teeth. "We are not in a position to make demands." Patricia stared at her husband in absolute shock before angrily digging into her designer purse and throwing her driver's license into the plastic tray. Ashley quietly handed hers over, avoiding eye contact with the intimidating guards. William placed his own license down and waited in humiliating silence. The officer ran their IDs through a scanner, printed out three generic paper visitor badges, and pointed toward a row of metal detectors. "Clip these to your lapels and proceed through the scanners," the officer instructed. "Empty your pockets and place all briefcases on the conveyor belt." Patricia looked at the metal detectors as if they were torture devices. She had never been subjected to a common security screening in her life. She was used to being ushered through private entrances and VIP lanes. Now she was being forced to take off her shoes and place her expensive handbag onto a dirty plastic belt right next to delivery drivers and entry-level clerks. She bit the inside of her cheek, tasting copper as she submitted to the degrading process. The security guard's wand swept over her, sending a sharp beep through the air when it hit her metal zipper. She closed her eyes, swallowing the burning bile of her destroyed pride. Once they finally cleared the security checkpoint, William gathered his heavy briefcase and led his wife and daughter toward the designated executive elevator bank. A digital display above the polished steel doors indicated they were heading to the 60th floor. The doors slid open with a soft chime and they stepped into the sleek mirrored cab. As the elevator began its rapid ascent, a suffocating silence fell over the small enclosed space. The physical pressure of the climbing altitude mirrored the crushing psychological weight bearing down on their chests. William stared blankly at the changing numbers above the door, his lips moving silently as he rehearsed his pathetic pitch over and over again. He was practicing the exact phrasing he would use to explain away the massive gaps in his financial ledgers, hoping the anonymous billionaire waiting at the top would show a sliver of mercy. He planned to offer 30% of his remaining equity just to keep his family out of a federal penitentiary. Ashley leaned against the mirrored wall of the elevator, picking nervously at her cuticles. She was mourning the permanent loss of her social status, terrified of facing the friends she had bragged to just days ago. She kept practicing her own desperate apologies, planning to beg the executive to release the lien on her boutique so she could at least salvage her personal brand. She was entirely willing to throw her father under the bus if it meant saving her own skin. Patricia stood frozen in the center of the elevator, her perfectly manicured hands trembling at her sides. She stared at her own reflection in the mirrored doors, barely recognizing the terrified woman looking back at her. She tried to summon her signature rage to find someone else to blame for this catastrophic failure. But the sheer magnitude of the Vanguard building, the relentless security guards, and the undeniable reality of their bankruptcy stripped away her last remaining layers of delusion. They were completely at the mercy of a corporate raider who had casually dismantled their lives without ever showing a face. The elevator hummed smoothly as it bypassed dozens of commercial floors, carrying them higher into the rarefied air of the absolute financial elite. William wiped a thick bead of cold sweat from his forehead, gripping the handle of his leather briefcase so tightly his aging joints actively ached. He closed his eyes and silently prayed for a sudden miracle he knew he had no right to ask for. The digital display blinked brightly, indicating they had finally reached the 60th floor. The fast elevator slowed to a smooth halt, and a crisp chime echoed through the small, confined cabin. The heavy polished steel doors slid open, revealing a sprawling, ultra-modern reception area, bathed in bright natural light. William took a shuddering breath, stepping tentatively out of the elevator and leading his broken family directly into the corporate beast. The 60th floor was quieter than the lobby below, but the silence did not feel welcoming. It felt controlled. William stepped out of the elevator first with Patricia and Ashley close behind him. A receptionist in a minimalist black dress waited behind a long stone desk. She glanced at the visitor badges clipped to their coats, checked the time on her screen, and offered no sign that the Crestwood name meant anything to her. William cleared his throat. "We have a 10 o'clock meeting with the Chief Executive Officer regarding the Crestwood restructuring." The receptionist looked at the monitor for several seconds before nodding once. "The executive office is aware that you have arrived. Please follow me." Relief flashed across Patricia's face too quickly. She seemed to assume the humiliations were finally over. The receptionist led them down a short side corridor instead of toward the massive boardroom doors, visible farther across the floor. She stopped beside a glass-walled conference room containing a narrow table, 6 identical chairs, and nothing else. No artwork, no refreshments, no view worth admiring. It looked less like a place for negotiations than a transparent holding cell. "You will wait here until the executive is ready to receive you," the receptionist said. William frowned. "Our meeting is scheduled for 10. "Yes, sir. It is 10 now." The receptionist gave him the same neutral expression the lobby guards had worn downstairs. "The executive is aware that you are here. Please remain in this room. Someone will come for you." Before William could object, she stepped away and disappeared down the corridor. The glass door closed with a soft click. For the first few minutes, none of them sat. William placed his leather briefcase on the table and checked his watch twice. Patricia paced from one transparent wall to the other, staring at employees moving through the surrounding offices. Nobody looked in. Nobody whispered about them. People carried tablets, reviewed documents, and continued their work, as if the once powerful Crestwood family were completely invisible. "This is deliberate," Patricia hissed. "They are trying to humiliate us." William opened the briefcase. "Then let them. We are not leaving." He removed the desperate financial projections he had assembled overnight and spread them across the table. He had built 3 restructuring proposals during the drive from Boston. The first offered Vanguard 30% of Crestwood. The second offered 40%. The third surrendered voting control, but allowed William to retain the family name on the company. Every version depended on the unknown executive valuing the Crestwood legacy more than the numbers suggested. Ashley sat in the corner and stared at her phone. The screen was filled with unanswered messages she had sent to former friends after her boutique collapsed. A few social media accounts had already removed photographs from her launch parties. The people who once competed for invitations to her events were erasing evidence that they had ever been close to her. She locked the phone and shoved it into her purse. "How long can they keep us in here?" she whispered. "As long as they want," William said without looking up. Patricia stopped pacing. "No, we came here because they asked us to come. We are not random applicants begging for an interview. We are stakeholders in a major real estate company." William looked up sharply. We are debtors in default. Learn the difference before you ruin the only chance we have left. 20 minutes passed, then 40. No one entered the room. The glass walls became part of the punishment. Patricia could see a coffee station across the corridor. Employees stopped there, filled ceramic cups, and continued walking. Nobody offered the Crestwoods water. A junior analyst passed the conference room carrying a stack of files and did not glance inside. Another employee laughed quietly at something on a tablet. The ordinary rhythm of the office continued around them, indifferent to their panic. Patricia knocked on the glass once when the receptionist crossed the hall. The woman paused and opened the door. We have been waiting almost an hour, Patricia said. Surely there has been some mistake. There is no mistake, the receptionist replied. We have not even been offered coffee. The receptionist looked at her for a moment. I can bring you water if medically necessary. At the 90-minute mark, William's confidence began to fracture visibly. He reviewed the same ledger page again and again, tracing columns with his finger. Every time he reached the transfers he had hidden, his breathing changed. The numbers were no longer abstract accounting tricks. They were evidence. He imagined federal investigators reconstructing each transaction, imagined headlines carrying his name, imagined a judge reading the same pages in a courtroom. Ashley noticed the sweat gathering at his hairline. Dad, are they really able to send you to prison? She asked. William did not answer immediately. Dad, if they have the complete records, yes. Patricia stared at him. You told me those transfers were protected. I told you what you wanted to hear because every time I said we needed to cut spending, you acted as if I were trying to destroy you. Do not blame me for your accounting. I moved money to keep your life functioning, William shot back. The estate, the gala, Ashley's store, the club bills, the cars. None of it was paying for itself anymore. Ashley flinched. Do not put my store into this. Your store existed because Crestwood paid its losses, William said. Without the company, you never had a business. Patricia rose again, but the old fury had nowhere to go. She walked to the glass wall and stared at her own reflection layered over the Manhattan skyline. In Boston, she had built an identity around being recognized. Restaurant managers knew her table. Club employees knew her preferences. Contractors knew not to keep her waiting. Here she had been searched in a public lobby, given a paper badge, and placed in a transparent room where nobody cared whether she was comfortable. Maybe we should leave, she whispered. William's head snapped up. Leave and go where? We could hire counsel in Boston. We could fight them from home. With what money? Every meaningful account is frozen. The firms I called want retainers we cannot pay. If we walk out now, Vanguard sends the files to the authorities. That email was explicit. Patricia lowered herself into the chair. For the first time all morning, she had no reply. The 2-hour mark arrived without ceremony. William checked his watch and gave a short, broken laugh. They had made one of the most arrogant families in Boston sit in a glass box for 120 minutes, and the most terrifying part was that Vanguard had not needed to threaten them once. The waiting had done the work. She opened the glass door and looked at the three of them. The executive will see you now. William gathered his projections with trembling hands and shoved them back into the briefcase. Ashley wiped beneath her eyes and straightened her coat. Patricia smoothed the front of her charcoal suit, but the gesture could not restore the authority she had carried into the building. They followed the receptionist into the long, silent corridor leading toward the far end of the executive floor. With every step, the glass offices gave way to darker wood and greater privacy. The corridor ended at a pair of massive oak doors. William stopped for half a second, gripping the handle of his briefcase. Patricia stood behind him, breathing shallowly. Ashley lowered her head. The receptionist placed one hand on the door. Whatever apologies, excuses, and bargains the Crestwoods had rehearsed during the drive had been worn down by 2 hours of waiting. They were no longer arriving as the rulers of a legacy empire. They were arriving as desperate debtors asking a stranger not to destroy them. The receptionist pushed the heavy oak doors open and stepped aside. Please enter. William swallowed the dry lump in his throat and stepped across the threshold. The room they entered was absolutely breathtaking. It was a sprawling, sunlit boardroom commanding the entire corner of the skyscraper. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a dizzying panoramic view of the Manhattan skyline, placing the city at the feet of whoever occupied the space. A massive table carved from a single slab of dark polished wood dominated the center, surrounded by sleek, ergonomic chairs. The sheer scale was designed to intimidate, reminding visitors they were stepping into an arena where billions of dollars changed hands daily. At the far end of the table, sitting with its back turned completely toward them, was a high-backed leather executive chair. The chair faced the sprawling city view, offering the trio nothing but a wall of dark leather. William felt a cold bead of sweat slowly drip down his spine. He took a hesitant step forward, his shoes making no sound on the plush carpet. He stopped near the middle of the long table, afraid to approach any closer to the silent figure facing the window. Patricia and Ashley shuffled into the room, hovering anxiously near the heavy oak doors as if preparing to flee. Patricia wrapped her arms tightly around her waist, her arrogant posture completely replaced by a shrinking, terrified submission. She stared at the back of the chair, her mind racing with desperate prayers for a miracle. Ashley kept her eyes glued to the floor, refusing to look at the sweeping city views that only reminded her of the elite lifestyle she was rapidly losing. William set his briefcase onto the polished table, his hands trembling so violently he struggled to unfasten the brass clasps. "Good morning," William began, his voice cracking pitifully in the vast open space of the boardroom. He cleared his throat, trying desperately to summon the booming, authoritative tone he used to bully local contractors back in Boston. "I am William Crestwood. I appreciate you taking the time to meet with my family today. I know your schedule is incredibly demanding, and I assure you we are here to offer a mutually beneficial solution to our current financial situation." The figure in the high-backed leather chair did not move. There was no acknowledgement of his greeting, no subtle shift in posture to indicate they were listening. The absolute silence was deafening, putting agonizing pressure on William's chest. He pulled a thick stack of papers from his briefcase, his hands shaking so badly the pages rattled against each other. He laid them out on the table, presenting his flawed ledgers and desperate projections to the back of the chair. "I know Vanguard Solutions has acquired the primary mezzanine debt for Crestwood Estates." William continued, his voice growing frantic as the silence stretched on. "I am fully aware of the default notice and the subsequent freeze on our operational accounts. I also know you have reviewed our internal ledgers." He paused, taking a ragged breath before uttering the words that destroyed his pride. "I admit there have been significant discrepancies in our accounting. We over-leveraged our assets and shifted funds improperly to cover temporary shortfalls. It was a severe error in judgment, and I take full responsibility for those actions." He was sweating profusely now, his face slick and pale. He was laying his crimes bare before a stranger groveling for his freedom. "But we are a legacy company," William pleaded, leaning forward, gripping the edge of the mahogany table. "We have prime real estate developments halfway completed. If you liquidate us now, the losses will be catastrophic for everyone involved. But if you allow us to restructure the debt, if you give us a grace period to secure new capital, I am willing to sign over 40% of our total equity to Vanguard Solutions. You can take a controlling interest in our board. We will give you anything you want. Just please, I am begging you, do not send those files to the federal authorities. Do not destroy my family." William fell silent, his chest heaving as he gasped for air. He had surrendered everything. He had laid his entire empire, his pride and his freedom, at the feet of the anonymous corporate predator. He waited for a response, hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. For a long, agonizing moment, the room remained perfectly still. The only sound was the faint hum of the climate control system and the ragged breathing of Patricia standing near the doorway. Then very slowly the high-backed leather chair began to swivel around. William held his breath, bracing himself to look into the eyes of a ruthless billionaire executive. Patricia lifted her chin, trying to muster a brave face for the man who held her fate in his hands. Ashley finally looked up from the floor, tears brimming in her eyes. The chair turned smoothly, completing its rotation to face the length of the long mahogany table. The collective shock that slammed into the three of them was violently physical. It hit them with the force of a freight train, driving the breath from their lungs and freezing the blood in their veins. Rachel sat in the chair. She was wearing a perfectly tailored designer suit in a deep charcoal gray that radiated absolute untouchable authority. Her posture was flawless. Her shoulders relaxed, her expression a mask of serene, chilling calm. She sat with her hands steepled flawlessly resting on the polished surface of the desk in front of her. She looked exactly like the apex predator they had been so terrified to meet. Standing quietly by the floor-to-ceiling window bathed in the morning sunlight was David. He wore a sharp dark suit, his hands resting casually in his pockets. He looked down at his parents and his sister with a mixture of profound pity and absolute disgust. He did not say a word, he simply watched the execution unfold. William stood frozen, his eyes bulging as he stared at the woman sitting at the head of the table. His brain completely short-circuited, unable to process the impossible image before him. The ruthless billionaire who had systematically dismantled his 30-year empire was the same quiet accountant he had mocked at his dining table. His hands went slack. The heavy leather briefcase slipped from his trembling fingers, crashing onto the floor. The files he had prepared scattered across the carpet in a chaotic mess. Near the heavy doors, Patricia let out a horrified gasp and stumbled backward until her back hit the wall. Ashley covered her mouth in pure terror. Rachel finally broke the heavy silence, her voice echoing with devastating clarity. "You wanted to see the CEO." William stared at me, his mouth opening and closing silently. The reality of his catastrophic failure was written in the trembling lines of his face. He was facing the daughter-in-law his family had systematically abused. Beside him, Patricia seemed unable to comprehend the words I had spoken. "This is a sick joke," Patricia stammered, her voice barely a whisper. "David, tell her to stop playing this ridiculous game. Get out of that chair right now." David remained standing by the window, watching his mother flail in the face of her own demise. "I am not playing a game, Patricia," I said, keeping my voice perfectly even. "I am the founder and sole owner of Vanguard Solutions. I built this firm from the ground up, operating quietly while you spent your days judging people. I bought your debt. I froze your accounts. I padlocked your daughter's pathetic vanity project." Ashley let out a sharp sob from the doorway. She finally understood that the sudden collapse of her luxury brand was a targeted surgical strike orchestrated by the woman she had mocked for years. She sank to the floor, weeping over the loss of her fabricated identity. William finally found his voice, though it was incredibly fragile. "Rachel," he pleaded, taking a hesitant step toward the mahogany table. "Please, you have to understand the pressure we were under. We just needed a temporary bridge to keep the development sites active." I raised my hand, stopping his pathetic excuses. "I do not want to hear your justifications, William," I stated firmly. "I am not here to negotiate a bridge loan, and I am certainly not here to save your failing empire. I am here to dismantle it." I reached into my desk drawer and pulled out a thick red folder. The heavy thud it made as I dropped it onto the table echoed like a gunshot. He recognized the folder immediately. It was a precise duplicate of the shadow ledgers he kept locked inside his private study back in Boston. "You assumed you were outsmarting the system." I continued, spreading the damning documents across the table. "But numbers never lie, William." I pulled out a specific bank statement highlighting a series of massive unauthorized transfers. "Over the past 5 years, you have systematically falsified your asset valuations to secure commercial loans you never had the collateral to back. You illegally siphoned capital from your employee retirement funds to cover your operating losses. You committed textbook wire fraud." William gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles turning stark white. "You stole my private records," he accused, his voice shaking with sheer terror. "I did not steal anything, William." I corrected him smoothly. "When your creditors began panicking over your missed payments, they gladly opened their books to Vanguard Solutions. I reconstructed the timeline of your spectacular failure. You built a house of cards and you handed me the matches." I reached into the folder one last time and pulled out a single crisp sheet of legal paper. I slid it across the smooth surface of the table. "This is the only lifeline you are going to get," I told him. "It is a comprehensive transfer of ownership agreement. I am offering you a single brutal choice today. You will sign over 100% of Crestwood Estates to Vanguard Solutions. This includes every commercial property, every residential development, and every piece of heavy machinery associated with your brand. Patricia let out a horrified shriek, lunging forward to grab her husband's arm. "You cannot do that!" she screamed, her face contorting with panic. "Crestwood is my family legacy. You are not taking my life away from me." I shifted my gaze to Patricia, pinning her under a cold stare. "I am not finished, Patricia," I said sharply. "The transfer also includes the total forfeiture of your personal assets, your investment portfolios, your offshore accounts, and the title to the Boston estate. Furthermore, Ashley will sign over all remaining intellectual property associated with her defunct lifestyle brand. I am taking absolutely everything that carries your name." William stared at the transfer document, his eyes welling with tears of profound defeat. "And what do we get in return?" he whispered. "You get to stay out of a federal penitentiary," I answered bluntly. "If you sign this document today, Vanguard Solutions will acquire your toxic debt and absorb the losses. You will walk out of this building with absolutely nothing, but you will walk out as free citizens. The purchase price for your entire miserable empire is exactly $1. I reached into my pocket, pulled out a crisp $1 bill, and laid it on top of the contract. "If you refuse to sign," I continued, "I will immediately transmit the unredacted accounting fraud files to the Securities and Exchange Commission. The federal authorities will raid your offices before you even make it back to Boston. You will spend the rest of your natural lives rotting in a concrete cell. That is my final offer. Choose." William stared at the single-dollar bill, his mind buckling under the absolute certainty of my threat. He slowly reached out, his trembling fingers brushing against the heavy stock paper of the contract. "No," Patricia shrieked, grabbing his wrist and attempting to pull his hand away. "Do not sign it, William. She is bluffing. We can fight this in court. We can hire the best defense attorneys in the country. They will tie her up in litigation for decades. We do not have any money for attorneys." Patricia, William roared, the sudden explosion of his voice, startling everyone in the room. He turned to his wife, his face twisted in a mask of total devastation. "We have nothing left. She outplayed us. If we fight this, we go to prison. It is over." Patricia stumbled backward as if she had been physically struck. The reality of their absolute ruin finally shattered the last remaining barriers of her toxic narcissism. She was a desperate, frightened woman facing total annihilation. Her eyes darted wildly around the boardroom, searching for any possible escape route. She looked at me sitting behind the desk with calm authority and realized she would find absolutely no mercy there. Her gaze shifted frantically to the floor-to-ceiling window, where her son stood watching the scene unfold with silent judgment. Patricia scrambled across the room toward David. She threw herself at him, grabbing the lapels of his dark suit. "David, please," she sobbed, her voice cracking as tears streamed down her perfectly manicured face. "You have to stop her. You have to make your wife listen to reason. You cannot let her do this to your own family. We are your blood, David." She fell to her knees, her hands sliding down his suit jacket to grip his arms. "I am your mother," she wept, her voice echoing pitifully in the massive room. "I carried you. I raised you. I gave you everything you ever wanted. You know I only ever wanted the absolute best for you. Please do not let her destroy us. I am begging you as your mother, save us." David looked down at the woman kneeling on the floor before him. He did not reach out to help her up. He stared at her with a profound, absolute disgust that seemed to chill the very air in the boardroom. He saw her clearly for the first time in his entire life, not as a powerful matriarch, but as a cruel, manipulative bully who had finally been cornered by her own malicious actions. David slowly, deliberately reached down and peeled his mother's desperate fingers off his arms. He stepped backward, putting a distinct physical distance between them. His voice dropped to a low, steady rumble that carried a chilling sense of finality. "You do not get to call yourself my mother," David said, his tone devoid of any warmth or affection. "You spent my entire life trying to control my every move. You used your money as a weapon to keep everyone living in constant fear, and when you realized you could not control the woman I chose to love, you tried to destroy her. You tried to ruin my career. You tried to take my daughter." Patricia stayed on her knees, weeping openly, as the harsh truth of her son's words struck her like physical blows. David looked at her without a single ounce of pity. "You lost your son the night you slapped my wife," he told her, his voice echoing with devastating finality. The absolute silence in the boardroom was heavy enough to crush bone. David turned his back on his mother and walked over to stand behind my chair, resting his hands firmly on my shoulders. He had made his choice, and he had chosen the family we built together. Patricia remained on the floor, her flawless makeup completely ruined by her tears. She looked up at her son, waiting for a glimmer of hesitation or change of heart. When she realized that his rejection was permanent, the last remaining spark of her arrogant spirit extinguished. She slumped against the plush carpet, a hollow broken shell of the terrifying matriarch she used to be. William knew the battle was entirely lost. His movements were stiff and labored, making him look like a man who had aged 20 years in a matter of minutes. He stared at the single crisp dollar bill resting on top of the transfer agreement. It was the ultimate insult, a perfectly calculated symbol of his total defeat. He reached out with a trembling hand and picked up the heavy silver pen I had placed next to the documents. I knew that my attorneys had crafted an ironclad contract that would strip him of every single asset he had ever accumulated. William pressed the tip of the pen against the thick paper. He signed his name on the designated ends, his signature shaky and unrecognizable. When he finished, he dropped the pen as if it had burned his skin. He stepped back from the table, his chest heaving with silent, dry sobs. He had just signed away 30 years of ruthless ambition and corrupt dealing. Patricia slowly pulled herself up from the floor. She approached the table like a condemned prisoner approaching the gallows. She picked up the pen, her hands shaking so violently she could barely grip the metal barrel. She looked at me, her eyes wide with a desperate, pleading terror. I maintained my cold, composed expression, offering her absolutely no comfort. She looked down at the paper and signed away her luxury vehicles, her designer jewelry, her offshore accounts, and the sprawling Boston estate she had ruled like a tyrant. Finally, it was Ashley who stepped forward. She was weeping openly, her face red and blotchy. She picked up the pen and signed away the remaining intellectual property of her bankrupt lifestyle brand. She surrendered the last pathetic shreds of her fabricated identity. When the final signature was secured, I reached out and pulled the contract toward me. I picked up the single-dollar bill and slid it across the smooth surface of the table until it rested right in front of William. "The transaction is officially complete," I stated, my voice ringing with absolute authority. "Vanguard Solutions now owns 100% of Crestwood Estates and all associated personal assets. You are no longer relevant to this firm or to the financial markets. My security team will escort you out of the building. You are never to contact my husband, my daughter, or me again. If you attempt to violate that boundary, I will not hesitate to release the fraud files to the authorities." The three of them turned and walked toward the heavy oak doors. They moved in a silent, agonizing sequence, completely stripped of their dignity and their power. The ride down to the lobby was suffocatingly quiet. When the polished steel doors slid open, they stepped out into the harsh fluorescent lighting of the reception area. William, Patricia, and Ashley walked out onto the freezing Manhattan sidewalk. The bitter winter wind hit their faces, biting through their expensive coats. They stood on the busy street corner watching the wealthy executives and rushing commuters hurry past them. They were leaving with absolutely nothing. Their legacy was permanently erased, their wealth completely absorbed by the woman they had repeatedly called trash. They were completely, entirely ruined. 6 months passed, bringing a warm, bright summer that washed away the bitter memories of that freezing winter morning in New York. The reality of the Crestwood collapse was swift and unforgiving. Patricia and William now lived in a cramped 2-bedroom rental apartment in a run-down neighborhood on the outskirts of Boston. The transition from a sprawling multi-million-dollar estate to a dingy walk-up had shattered Patricia completely. Patricia spent her days sitting on a cheap fabric sofa, staring blankly at a small television. She occasionally tried to call the wealthy socialites she used to host for lavish dinner parties. Every single call went straight to voicemail. Her elite social circle had abandoned her the exact second the news of the Crestwood bankruptcy hit the local papers. William spent his time pacing the small kitchen, calculating pennies to ensure they could afford their modest utility bills. The stress of his downfall had aged him considerably, leaving him a quiet, broken man who rarely spoke. Ashley faced a harsh reckoning. Without her father's money to subsidize her lavish lifestyle, she entered the actual workforce for the first time in her life. She currently worked a minimum wage job as a sales associate at a discount retail store in a suburban strip mall. She spent her days folding cheap clothes and dealing with rude, demanding customers. She was finally experiencing exactly what it felt like to be treated with the same cruel, dismissive arrogance she had weaponized against service workers her entire life. Her designer wardrobe was long gone sold to consignment shops just to cover her basic rent and groceries, while they slowly suffered the truly miserable consequences of their own malicious actions. My life had completely blossomed into a masterpiece of absolute peace and untouchable security. Vanguard Solutions had seamlessly absorbed and restructured the Crestwood assets, turning a massive profit in the first quarter alone. But my greatest personal triumph was not financial. It was the beautiful, quiet life David and I had built together far away from the toxic influence of his family. It was late Saturday afternoon, and the golden hour sun was casting a warm, glowing light across our private coastal retreat. I had purchased a stunning, secluded beach house perched on a quiet bluff overlooking the ocean. The property featured wide wraparound decks and floor-to-ceiling windows that let in the soothing sound of the crashing waves. I stood on the wooden deck holding a glass of iced tea and taking a deep breath of the salty ocean air. Down on the private stretch of pristine white sand, David was chasing Lily near the water edge. Lily let out a joyous, shrieking laugh as David scooped her up and spun her around in a dizzying circle. Her bright blonde hair caught the sunlight, and her face was a picture of pure, unadulterated happiness. David was smiling widely, his shoulders relaxed, his entire demeanor reflecting a profound sense of freedom. He had recently accepted a tenured position at a prestigious university, completely unburdened by the heavy expectations of the Crestwood name. I leaned against the wooden railing, watching my family with a fierce, overwhelming love. The toxic ties that had threatened to suffocate us were permanently severed. They had tried to break me, assuming that my quiet demeanor meant I was weak and defenseless. They had underestimated my intelligence, my resilience, and my absolute devotion to protecting my family. I had taken their cruelty, their arrogance, and their desperate attempts at sabotage, and I had used them as fuel to forge an indestructible armor. I systematically dismantled their entire empire and replaced it with my own. I had built a fortress of undeniable security, where my husband and my daughter could thrive without fear. As I watched David carry Lily up the wooden stairs toward the deck, her small arms wrapped tightly around his neck, I smiled a genuine, radiant smile. I had secured our future, and in the end, that was the sweetest, most satisfying victory of all. Looking back on everything that happened, the greatest lesson I learned is that true power does not roar. It does not need to slap someone across the face at a dinner table or scream demands in a crowded lobby. Real power is built quietly, day by day, through hard work and undeniable competence. My in-laws believed that their last name and their bank accounts gave them the right to treat people like disposable garbage. They confused inherited privilege with actual strength. They were so blinded by their own arrogance that they never saw their empire crumbling until it was already dust. Sometimes the most devastating revenge you can inflict on toxic people is simply letting them suffer the natural consequences of their own malicious actions. You do not have to accept abuse just because it comes from family. You have the right to walk away to protect your peace and to build a fortress that they can never breach. Have you ever had to stand your ground against a toxic family member who thought they could control your life? How did you find the courage to finally walk away? Share your stories in the comments below. If my journey resonated with you, please hit the like button and subscribe to hear more stories about finding your strength and taking back your power. Thank you for listening, and remember that your worth is never determined by someone else's inability to see